You will always be the family failure." My older sister laughed, raising her crystal champagne glass, while her wealthy chief executive boyfriend watched me freeze in my chair. For years, I had quietly covered her massive debts, hidden her lies, and swallowed my pride just so my parents could have one peaceful Christmas. I was the good daughter, the invisible financial compliance officer who kept this family from going bankrupt. But when her boyfriend opened the plain red folder I brought to dinner that night, the smug look wiped right off his face. He fired her before the main course was even served. "My name is Sarah. I am 29 years old, and I work as a senior financial compliance officer for a major logistics firm here in the city. My job is to find the lies people hide in spreadsheets. I track the missing money, the inflated invoices, the phantom expenses that corporate fraudsters think no one will ever notice. I am very good at my job. I have built a career on exposing the truth when others try to bury it. But for my entire life, the biggest frauds I dealt with were sitting across from me at my own family dining table. It was Christmas Eve. The dining room of my parents' house smelled of roasted turkey pine needles and the expensive designer perfume my sister Jessica was wearing. Everything in that room was meticulously designed to look like a magazine cover. The silver cutlery caught the light from the crystal chandelier. The linen napkins were perfectly pressed, but it was all a beautifully constructed illusion, and I was the one secretly footing the bill for the stage props. My mother, Linda, was bustling around the kitchen in a silk dress she could not actually afford, pouring imported wine for our guest of honor. My father, Robert, sat at the head of the table, wearing a tailored suit and a proud, inflated smile. And then there was Jessica, my 31-year-old sister, sitting next to the man who was supposed to be her golden ticket. Julian Reed was 34 years old. He was the founder and chief executive officer of a rapidly growing tech startup downtown. He was smart, wealthy, and deeply in love with the version of Jessica she had presented to him. According to Julian, Jessica was his brilliant director of marketing, a woman who had single-handedly doubled his company engagement over the past 6 months. He did not know the real Jessica. He did not know that the designer dress she was wearing was paid for with a credit card that was legally under my name. He did not know that I spent every Sunday night balancing her personal budgets so she would not default on her luxury car loan. And he certainly did not know that she had dropped out of college in her sophomore year, meaning the shiny business degree framed on her office wall was a complete fabrication. For years, I had kept my mouth shut. I was the younger sister who drove a battered 10-year-old sedan, lived in a modest apartment, and worked quietly in a cubicle. My parents constantly reminded me of my place. Whenever I brought up Jessica and her unpaid debts, my mother would shush me. She would say that Jessica just needed time to find the right opportunity. She would tell me that family support family and that I should be happy to help my sister succeed. So I stayed quiet. I absorbed the financial hits. I endured the passive-aggressive comments at every holiday gathering. I did it because I believed that keeping the peace was my duty. But the peace was about to shatter. Dinner had just started when the conversation shifted exactly where Jessica wanted it to go. Julian was telling a story about a recent product launch, praising Jessica for her visionary marketing strategy. My parents beamed with pride. My father clapped Julian on the shoulder, calling him the son he always wanted. Then Jessica stood up. She tapped her silver fork against her crystal wine glass, demanding the attention of the room. A smug, radiant smile spread across her perfectly made-up face. "I would like to propose a toast," Jessica announced. Her voice dripped with fake sweetness. "First to my wonderful parents who always believed in my potential. And to my amazing boyfriend, Julian, who finally gave me the platform to show the world what I can do." She paused, turning her gaze directly toward me. The smile on her face turned sharp and cruel. And of course, to my little sister, Sarah. She raised her glass higher, her eyes locking onto mine with absolute malice. To Sarah, who still drives that tragic 10-year-old car and spends her days crunching numbers in a tiny cubicle. Do not worry, Sarah. Maybe next year you will not be the family failure. Maybe if you watch and learn from me, you will figure out how to be successful too. The air in the room seemed to freeze. I looked at Julian. A brief flicker of discomfort crossed his face, but he quickly masked it with a polite smile, probably thinking this was just typical sibling rivalry. I looked at my parents. They did not reprimand her. They did not tell her she had gone too far. Instead, my father let out a booming laugh. "Your sister has a point, Sarah. My father said, waving his fork at me. You really need to step up your game. You cannot just hide behind a desk your whole life. You need to learn how to present yourself. Learn from Jessica. She knows how to navigate the real world. My mother chimed in, nodding enthusiastically as she took a sip of her wine. We just want you to be ambitious, Sarah. It breaks our heart to see you settling for such a mediocre life when your sister is out there conquering the corporate world. They all laughed. It was a warm, shared family laugh that completely excluded me. They sat there in the house I was secretly helping to pay for drinking the wine I had purchased, wearing the clothes my credit had subsidized, and they called me a failure. In the past, I would have looked down at my plate. I would have felt the familiar sting of tears behind my eyes. I would have excused myself to the bathroom, cried in secret, and come back out to finish my meal in silence. I would have accepted the humiliation because that is what the scapegoat does. But not tonight. Tonight, I did not cry. My heart was not racing with anxiety. It was beating with a slow, steady rhythm of absolute clarity. I looked at Jessica, basking in the glow of her cruel joke, and I felt nothing but a cold, clinical resolve. The kind of resolve I feel when I find a massive discrepancy in a fraudulent tax return. I reached down into the leather tote bag resting at my feet. My hands were perfectly steady. I pulled out a thick, plain red folder. I placed it squarely on the dining table right next to the expensive centerpiece. The bright red cover contrasted sharply with the pristine white tablecloth. "What is that?" my mother asked, her tone shifting from jovial to annoyed. "Sarah, please do not bring work documents to the Christmas table. We are trying to have a nice evening." "It is not my work," I said. My voice was calm and even. I looked directly at Julian. "It is a Christmas gift. For Julian." Julian raised an eyebrow, looking surprised, but intrigued. He set his wineglass down and reached across the table to pick up the red folder. "A gift?" he asked, a polite smile returning to his face. "You did not have to do that, Sarah. What is it?" Jessica let out a dramatic sigh, rolling her eyes. "Oh my God, Sarah. Did you print out an article about retirement savings again? Julian does not need your boring financial advice." Julian opened the folder. The polite smile on his face did not just fade. It evaporated completely. The first page inside that folder was a comprehensive background check report. The second page was a certified transcript from the university. Jessica claimed she had graduated from clearly showing she had dropped out with a failing grade point average in her second year. The third page was the real bombshell. As a compliance officer, I know exactly how to trace digital money. It had taken me 3 weeks of quiet, relentless digging to uncover the truth about Jessica and her brilliant marketing strategy. She had not doubled Julian and his company engagement. She had been hiring overseas click farms to generate fake traffic, artificially inflating the company metrics to make herself look like a corporate genius. But that was not the worst part. The worst part was the invoices. I watched Julian and his eyes dart back and forth across the pages. The muscles in his jaw tightened. His knuckles turned white as he gripped the edge of the folder. He turned to the fourth page. It was a stack of billing records. Jessica had been approving massive monthly payments to a third-party marketing vendor called Apex Digital Solutions. She had told Julian it was a premier advertising agency. My documents proved otherwise. I had pulled the state registration records for Apex Digital Solutions. It was a fake shell company registered to a post office box. And the primary beneficiary of the bank account tied to that shell company was Jessica herself. She had been embezzling from his company for 6 months, siphoning thousands of dollars to fund the lavish lifestyle she was currently showing off at this very table. "Julian, honey." "What is it?" Jessica asked. Her voice wavered slightly. She reached out to touch his arm, but he violently jerked away as if her skin was made of fire. "Do not touch me," Julian said. His voice was low, but it carried a terrifying edge. It was the voice of a man who had just realized he was sitting next to a predator. He flipped to the next page. It was a summary sheet I had created calculating the exact amount of money she had stolen. Next to it were copies of her bank deposits matching the exact dates and amounts of the fraudulent corporate invoices. The evidence was irrefutable. It was black and white. It was forensic proof of theft, fraud, and corporate sabotage. Julian stood up slowly. His chair scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. The cozy, festive atmosphere of the room was completely gone, replaced by a suffocating, heavy tension. My parents stopped smiling. My father put his fork down slowly. "Julian, Is everything okay? My father asked, trying to sound authoritative, but failing entirely. Julian did not look at my father. He did not look at me. He kept his eyes locked on Jessica. His face was a mask of cold fury. You told me you graduated with honors, Julian said, his voice deadly quiet. You told me those marketing vendors were industry leaders. You told me you loved me. Julian, what are you talking about? Jessica stammered. Her face was draining of color. She looked frantically at the red folder in his hands, finally realizing what it must contain. Sarah, what did you give him? What lies are you telling him? Julian picked up the folder and slammed it down onto the table. The sound echoed through the dining room like a gunshot. These are not lies, Julian said. His voice rose, vibrating with absolute betrayal. These are bank records. These are state filings. You set up a shell company and approved your own fake invoices. You have been stealing from my company since the day I promoted you. My mother gasped, dropping her linen napkin. That is impossible. Jessica would never do such a thing. Sarah, how dare you fabricate this garbage? I did not fabricate anything, I said. Looking straight at my mother, every document in that folder is a certified public record. I just knew where to look. Jessica stood up, her chair tipping over backward and crashing to the floor. She reached out for Julian again, tears springing to her eyes. The tears came so easily to her. They always had. Julian, please, you have to listen to me. I can explain. It is not what it looks like. Sarah is just jealous. She has always been jealous of me. She is trying to ruin my life because she is miserable. Explain? Julian asked. He laughed, a harsh, bitter sound that held zero humor. Explain how you forged a university degree. Explain how you funneled $70,000 of my operating budget into a fake bank account. Save your explanations for the police, Jessica. He took a step back, distancing himself from the table, from the family, from the illusion he had been sold. He looked at Jessica one last time. There was no love left in his eyes, only absolute disgust. Jessica? You are fired, Julian said. His voice was completely steady now, carrying the absolute authority of a chief executive officer. Do not ever step foot in my building again. Expect my lawyers to contact you on Monday morning. Julian, no, please. Jessica was sobbing now, full heaving sobs. She tried to grab his coat, but he stepped around her smoothly. He walked to the front hallway, grabbed his overcoat, and opened the front door. The freezing winter wind swept into the house, bringing a sudden chill into the warm dining room. He paused for a fraction of a second, glancing back toward where I sat. He gave me a single stiff nod of acknowledgement. Then he walked out into the night, slamming the heavy wooden door shut behind him. The sound of the door slamming finalized the destruction of Jessica and her entire world. For 10 agonizing seconds, there was absolute deathly silence in the room. No one moved, no one spoke. The only sound was the faint crackling of the fire in the living room hearth and the sound of Jessica and her ragged, panicked breathing. I sat perfectly still in my chair. I looked at the roasted turkey on the table. I looked at the crystal wine glasses. I looked at my sister, whose perfect designer facade was currently melting into a puddle of terrified tears. I looked at my parents, who were staring at the front door as if hoping Julian would suddenly walk back in and declare it was all a terrible mistake. But it was not a mistake, it was the truth, and the truth had finally arrived at the Christmas table. The heavy oak door rattled in its frame long after Julian was gone. The freezing draft he let in swept over the dining table, chilling the roasted turkey and making the flames of the tall candles flicker wildly. For a long moment, nobody moved. The perfect illusion my parents had spent years crafting was lying dead on the pristine white tablecloth. Then the silence broke. Jessica let out a visceral sound that was half scream and half sob. She lunged forward, grabbing the red folder with her manicured hands, and began tearing the pages. She ripped the bank statements, the fake invoices, the background check, shredding them into pieces and throwing them across the dining room as if destroying the paper would somehow erase what had just happened. My mother stood up, her chair scraping violently against the hardwood floor. Her face, usually so carefully composed and ready for Sunday service at the local Presbyterian church, was contorted into a mask of absolute hatred. She did not look at Jessica, the daughter who had just been exposed as a corporate thief and a fraud. She looked at me. "What is wrong with you?" my mother shrieked. Her voice was so loud and shrill, it echoed off the vaulted ceilings. "How could you do this to your own sister? How could you humiliate us like this in our own home? I sat there, my hands folded calmly in my lap. I did not humiliate you, I said, keeping my voice entirely steady. Jessica humiliated herself. She stole tens of thousands of dollars from the man she was sleeping with. I just provided the receipts. You ruined everything, Jessica screamed from the floor, surrounded by torn paper and her own ruined makeup. Julian was going to propose to me. We were going to buy a house in the hills. He was my golden ticket. And you destroyed it because you are a miserable, jealous loser who cannot stand to see anyone else happy. My mother rushed to Jessica, and her side kneeling on the floor in her expensive silk dress to wrap her arms around her weeping golden child. She glared up at me, her blue eyes flashing with a venom I had felt my entire life, but had never seen so openly displayed. You are sick, Sarah, my mother spat. You have ruined your sister and her chance to marry into a wealthy family. Do you have any idea what Julian could have done for this family? Do you know what kind of connections he has? You have completely destroyed our reputation. When the people at church hear about this, we will be ruined. I looked down at this woman, the woman who was supposed to be my mother, and felt a profound, exhausting wave of disgust. She did not care that her eldest daughter was a criminal. She did not care that Jessica had committed wire fraud. She only cared that the money was gone and that her fragile social standing was in jeopardy. Reputation. I asked, my voice dropping to a low, hard whisper. What reputation, Mum? The one where you pretend to be successful, pious pillars of the community. The one where you smile at the pastor every Sunday while living a lie the other 6 days of the week. Do not you dare speak to your mother that way, my father bellowed, finally finding his voice. He slammed his fist onto the table, making the crystal wine glasses rattle. You are completely out of line. You will apologize to your sister right now, and you will fix this. Fix this, I repeated. I stood up slowly. I was done making myself small. I was done absorbing their blows. How exactly do you want me to fix it, Dad? Do you want me to log into the corporate accounts and unsteal the money? Do you want me to go back in time and hand her a real college diploma? Because I have spent my entire adult life fixing Jessica and her mistakes, and I am officially done. You have never helped me, Jessica cried, pointing an accusing finger at me. You have always tried to tear me down. The sheer audacity of her lies snapped whatever remaining restraint I had left. I leaned over the table, bracing my hands on the wood, and let out a decade of buried truth. Never helped you, I said. My voice filled the room sharp and unyielding. I paid off your credit card debt for 5 years. You maxed out 4 different cards on designer clothes and vacations you could not afford. You were facing bankruptcy at 24. I worked 60-hour weeks and gave you every spare dollar I had, so your credit score would not be ruined. That was a loan, Jessica stammered, her eyes darting nervously toward our parents. A loan you never paid back, I countered instantly. Not a single cent. And what about college, Jessica? You called me every single night during your sophomore year, crying because you were failing your business classes. I wrote your essays. I did your finance assignments. I sacrificed my own sleep to make sure you passed, and you still dropped out because you were too busy partying. And then you lied to Mom and Dad, and you lied to Julian, claiming you graduated with honors. My parents stared at me, but they did not look shocked by the revelation. They looked angry that I was bringing it up. They had always known on some level that Jessica was a fraud. They just preferred my silence to the ugly truth. That is enough. Sarah, my mother said, standing up and smoothing her dress. Family supports family. You had a good job and your sister needed help. Needed. You should not be throwing your past favors in her face. That is not what good Christians do. I let out a harsh, bitter laugh. Good Christians? Is that what we are calling it now? Is that the excuse you use to justify bleeding me dry? You watch your tone, my father warned, stepping toward me. His face was red with fury. You live in this house. You respect the rules of this family. Actually, Dad, I said, looking him dead in the eye. I do not live in this house. I live in a tiny rundown apartment on the other side of the city. But you live in this house, and maybe we should talk about how exactly you afford to live here. My father froze. The color drained from his face just as quickly as it had from Julian and his face earlier. My mother took a sudden step back, her hand flying to her throat. Sarah, do not. Vahona, my mother whispered. The rage in her voice was suddenly replaced by genuine panic. Oh, we are doing this, I said. I stepped around the table, closing the distance between us. If we are talking about family sacrifices, let us talk about the $2,000 I transfer into your checking account on the first of every single month. Jessica looked up from the floor, her tear-streaked face twisting in confusion. What are you talking about? I did not break eye contact with my parents. I want Jessica to hear this. I want her to know how this perfect family actually survives. For the past 4 years, Mom and Dad have not been able to afford the mortgage on this beautiful magazine-ready house. Dad's consulting business went under years ago, and Mom refuses to get a real job because it would look bad to her friends at the country club and the Presbyterian church. Stop talking, my father commanded, his voice shaking with humiliation. So they came to the family failure. I continued, my voice ringing with undeniable authority. They came to the daughter who crunches numbers in a cubicle. They begged me for help. They told me that if they lost this house, they would lose everything. So I gave up my own savings. I gave up buying a new car. I gave up taking vacations. I sent them $2,000 every single month, just so they could keep up their pathetic facade of wealth. The silence that followed was suffocating. Jessica stared at our parents, waiting for them to deny it. They could not. The truth was too heavy, too real, and completely undeniable. All these years, I said, my voice dropping back to a quiet, intense volume. You sat around this table, wearing clothes I paid for, eating food I subsidized, and you let her call me a failure. You let her mock me. You joined in. You treated me like a parasite while you were the ones feeding off my blood. My mother began to cry, but they were not tears of guilt. They were tears of pure defensive embarrassment. How can you be so cruel? She sobbed, burying her face in her hands. After everything we did to raise you, we gave you life, and you took my future to pay for yours, I replied. My father could not handle the exposure. His pride, the only thing he truly valued, had been entirely dismantled in front of his golden child. His humiliation twisted into a violent, explosive rage. He marched across the room and pointed a trembling finger directly at the front door. Get out, my father roared. The veins in his neck strained against his collar. You ungrateful, vindictive little brat. You come into my home on Christmas Eve and destroy your sister, and then you try to shame us. I am not trying to shame you, Dad, I said calmly. The shame is already yours. I am just holding up the mirror. I said, get out, he screamed, his voice breaking. You are no daughter of mine. Do not ever come back here. You are completely dead to this family. I looked at him. I looked at the man who had happily taken my money for 48 months while treating me like dirt. I looked at my mother who was refusing to make eye contact with me. I looked at Jessica, the exposed fraud, still sitting on the floor amidst the shredded evidence of her crimes. I did not feel rejected. I felt incredibly, overwhelmingly free. I will gladly leave, I said. I picked up my leather tote bag and slung it over my shoulder. But remember this moment. Remember exactly what you said to me tonight. Because when the bank calls next month asking why the mortgage payment bounced, you can tell them that your daughter is dead. And when the police come knocking because Julian filed a corporate fraud report against Jessica, you can figure out how to pay for her defense attorney yourselves. I did not wait for their response. I turned my back on them and walked to the front hallway. I pulled my heavy wool coat from the closet and slipped it on. The house felt completely foreign to me now. It was no longer a home. It was just a building full of strangers who shared my last name. I opened the front door and stepped out into the freezing night. The snow was falling heavily, blanketing the suburban streets in a thick layer of white. The cold air hit my face, sharp and biting, but it felt remarkably clean. Behind me, I could hear my mother start to wail. I could hear Jessica screaming my name, the panic finally setting in as she realized the financial lifeline was completely and permanently severed. They were trapped in that house with the ruins of their own lives. I walked down the driveway toward my 10-year-old sedan. The snow crunched beneath my boots. I did not look back. I got into my car, turned the key, and listened to the engine roar to life. As I drove away from the neighborhood, watching their perfectly decorated house disappear in the rearview mirror, I smiled. The first strike had been delivered. They thought kicking me out was a punishment. They had no idea it was my liberation. And they had absolutely no idea what was coming next. I woke up the next morning to the sound of sleet scratching against my bedroom window. The radiator in my small apartment hissed and clanked, a stark metallic sound that contrasted sharply with the silent, climate-controlled luxury of the house I had just been thrown out of. I lay in my bed for a long time, staring up at the water stain on the ceiling. The adrenaline from Christmas Eve had completely faded from my system, leaving behind a deep hollow ache in my chest. For 29 years, I had been trained to fix things. I was the financial compliance officer of my family, the one who patched the holes, balanced the ledgers, and kept the sinking ship afloat at the cost of my own well-being. My first instinct, deeply ingrained by decades of emotional conditioning, was to panic. I thought about calling my mother, apologizing for ruining the holiday dinner, and offering to smooth things over with Julian. That is exactly what the family scapegoat is programmed to do. You are taught to absorb the blame so the rest of the family can maintain their comfortable illusions. But then I remembered the look of pure disgust on my father's face when he pointed at the front door. I remembered my mother claiming I was jealous defending a daughter who had just been exposed as a corporate thief. I remembered Jessica laughing at my 10-year-old car while wearing a designer dress my credit score had paid for. The sadness and the guilt evaporated like water on a hot stove. In its place, a sharp clinical focus settled over me. It was the exact same focus I used at work when I was tracking down a fraudulent corporate account. The time for crying was over. It was Christmas morning, and it was time to close the bank. I threw off the heavy blankets, walked into my small drafty kitchen, and opened my laptop on the laminate counter. I did not even bother making coffee yet. This task could not wait. I logged into my primary banking portal. The screen loaded, displaying the complex, parasitic web of financial lifelines I had established to keep my family completely insulated from the consequences of their own actions. It was time to cut the cords. I navigated to the scheduled transfers tab. There it was, right at the top of the list. $2,000 scheduled to withdraw on the 1st of every single month. I had labeled it Robert and Linda Mortgage Support. I hovered my cursor over the edit button. For 4 long years, I had watched that massive chunk of my hard-earned salary disappear. I thought about the vacations. I never took the winter coat. I did not buy the emergency savings fund. I had drained all to preserve their pride. They needed that massive colonial house so they could host the Sunday afternoon luncheons for the local Presbyterian church. They needed to look like successful, blessed pillars of the community. They had traded my financial security for their social status. I moved the cursor to the delete icon. The banking system generated a small pop-up window asking if I was absolutely sure I wanted to cancel this recurring transaction. I whispered yes to the empty kitchen and clicked confirm. The line vanished from the screen. A physical weight lifted off my shoulders, a sudden lightness that almost made me dizzy, but I was not done yet. Next was the autopay for Jessica and her premium auto insurance policy. It was $250 a month, so she could drive her luxury vehicle without a care in the world. She had convinced my parents that she could not afford the premium while she was building her marketing career, and my parents had bullied me into covering it so Jessica would not have to stress. Cancel, confirm, gone. Finally, I navigated to the credit card management page. I had opened a joint credit card 5 years ago to help my parents with groceries, during a month when my father claimed his consulting business was going through a dry spell. They had slowly and methodically taken it over, treating it like a bottomless slush fund. They used it for dinners out at expensive steakhouses, country club guest fees, and designer clothes for Jessica. The current balance was staggering. Because I am a compliance officer and I refuse to have my own credit score ruined by their negligence, I transferred funds from my personal savings to pay off the entire remaining balance. I cleared the debt completely. Then I clicked the account options and selected the button to lock the card. Another prompt appeared on the screen warning me that all authorized users would immediately be denied at the point of sale if I proceeded. I did not hesitate. I clicked lock. Just like that, the financial lifeline was severed. The Bank of Sarah was permanently closed. I shut my laptop, walked over to my coffee maker, and finally started a pot. I stood by the counter, watching the dark liquid drip into the glass carafe. And I waited. I knew it would not take long. My family lived on a fragile house of cards, built entirely on appearances, and funded entirely by my silent compliance. I had just pulled out the foundation, and it was only a matter of time before the entire structure collapsed. Exactly 3 hours later, my cell phone exploded. It started with a single, highly annoyed text message from my mother. It arrived at 10 in the morning. Sarah, why is the joint credit card being declined at the floral shop? I have 30 custom centerpieces to pay for before the church Christmas luncheon tomorrow. Call the bank and fix this glitch immediately. You're being incredibly irresponsible." I did not reply. I sat at my small kitchen table, holding my warm coffee mug, and watched the text bubble sit there on my screen. I imagined my mother standing at the florist counter wearing her expensive winter coat, trying to maintain her wealthy facade, while the cashier handed her card back with a sympathetic smile. 10 minutes later, my phone buzzed again. This time it was a phone call from Jessica. I stared at her name flashing on the screen and let it ring until it went to voicemail. 2 minutes after that, she sent a text message. The tone was completely unhinged, dripping with the arrogant entitlement she had carried her entire life. "Sarah, my card just got declined at the boutique downtown." The cashier looked at me like I was a criminal. "Unfreeze the account right now. You're acting like a psychotic child just because Julian dumped me. Fix it." I poured myself a second cup of black coffee, took a slow sip, and watched the digital avalanche of rage roll in. They came in rapid succession, a relentless barrage of messages that proved they still fundamentally misunderstood the situation. My father texted next. His message was brief, authoritative, and demanding. "Sarah, your mother is in tears at the florist. Stop throwing a temper tantrum and unlock the cards. You are embarrassing this family in public. We will deal with your behavior when you come over to apologize." I read the messages, shaking my head at the sheer audacity of these people. Even after I had exposed Jessica as a corporate fraud, even after my father had pointed at the door and screamed that I was dead to him, they still expected me to fund their lives. They genuinely believed that my money was their money, and that my boundaries were just a temporary inconvenience they could bully me out of. They thought I would cave because I had always caved. They thought the fear of being excluded from the family would bring me crawling back, checkbook in hand. By noon, the anger in their text messages began to morph into something else entirely. As they logged into their own banking portals and saw that the scheduled transfers had been completely wiped out, the reality of the situation finally pierced their bubble of delusion. The aggressive demands turned into absolute panic. My mother texted again, her tone shifting from commanding to desperate. "Sarah, please tell me this is a mistake. The mortgage automatic payment is not showing up on our account. The bank is going to pull the funds in 5 days. You know your father and I do not have the liquid cash for that right now. Please call us. We need to talk about this as a family. Do not do this to us on Christmas. You cannot just leave us stranded." Then came Jessica. Her messages dropped the arrogant facade entirely. The reality of losing Julian, losing her job, and losing her endless supply of my money had finally hit her. "Sarah, please pick up the phone. I cannot access my auto insurance portal. My policy is suspended. I need to drive to Julian and his office to beg him not to press charges. But I am terrified of getting pulled over without insurance. I have no money in my checking account. Please, Sarah, I am begging you. I am sorry about what I said at dinner. Just turn the insurance back on." I sat in my quiet, drafty apartment and looked at the long list of frantic messages lighting up my screen. For my entire life, reading those words would have sent me into a devastating spiral of guilt and anxiety. My heart would have raced. My stomach would have tied itself in knots. I would have felt personally responsible for their impending ruin. I would have rushed to log back into the bank, undo my actions, and sacrifice my own peace of mind just to stop their crying. But today, I felt nothing of the sort. I read their desperate pleas, and I felt nothing but a quiet, profound, and absolute peace. They were adults. They had made their choices. They had chosen to live beyond their means. They had chosen to lie, to steal, and to mock the only person who was holding their lives together. The consequences of those choices were finally arriving at their doorstep, and I was no longer going to stand in the way and absorb the impact for them. I opened the settings menu on my phone. I tapped on my father, and his contact profile scrolled down to the bottom of the screen and hit block caller. I watched his name disappear into the blocked list. I went back to my messages, tapped on my mother and her profile, and hit block caller. Finally, I opened Jessica and her contact page. I looked at the last message she sent, begging me to save her from the wreckage of her own fraudulent life. I hit block caller. I set the phone face down on the kitchen table. The constant buzzing and ringing ceased. The digital tether that had kept me bound to their endless demands was completely severed. The silence in my apartment was beautiful. It was not the heavy, oppressive silence of the dining room after Julian left. It was the sound of my life finally belonging entirely to me. I took a deep breath, savoring the feeling of absolute freedom. I did not have to fix anyone today. I did not have to cover anyone and their tracks. I was just Sarah, a financial compliance officer, enjoying a quiet Christmas morning in the city. I stood up from the table, intending to carry my empty coffee mug to the sink and maybe figure out what to make for lunch. But the quiet did not last long. Just as I turned the faucet on, the sharp, sudden sound of my apartment doorbell echoed through the small hallway. I froze. A sudden spike of adrenaline hit my chest, making my heart race. I looked at the digital clock on my microwave. It was 1 in the afternoon. I was not expecting any packages. I did not have any friends coming over. My immediate thought was that my parents had driven across the city to confront me in person. I thought maybe my mother was standing in the hallway, ready to bang on the door and scream about her floral arrangements. I thought maybe Jessica had come to scream at me face to face about her suspended insurance policy. I set the coffee mug down carefully in the sink. I walked slowly down the short hallway toward the front door, my boots making no sound on the floorboards. I held my breath as I leaned forward and looked through the small brass peephole. It was not my parents. It was not Jessica. Standing in the freezing, dimly lit hallway of my rundown apartment building, wearing a heavy tailored winter overcoat and holding a large sealed cardboard box full of corporate documents, was Julian Reed, the chief executive officer from last night. He looked exhausted, his jaw tight, his eyes focused squarely on my door number. He raised his hand and knocked twice a firm, deliberate sound that meant he was not leaving until I opened the door. I stood in the doorway of my apartment, my hand still resting on the deadbolt. The freezing winter air from the hallway drifted in, carrying the scent of damp wool from Julian and his heavy overcoat. He did not look like the confident, polished chief executive officer I had seen sitting at my parents' and their perfectly decorated dining table the night before. He looked like a man who had not slept a single minute. His eyes were bloodshot, his jaw was tight with stress, and in his arms he carried a massive cardboard banker box packed to the brim with file folders. "May I come in?" Julian asked. His voice was raspy, completely devoid of the polite social charm he had used during Christmas Eve dinner. I stepped back, opening the door wider to let him pass. I watched him walk into my small, drafty living room. My apartment was a fraction of the size of the grand suburban colonial house my parents lived in. I did not have a crystal chandelier or expensive silk curtains. I had a second-hand sofa, a reliable coffee maker, and a laptop sitting on a laminate kitchen counter. Julian set the heavy box down on my small dining table with a loud thud. He let out a long, exhausted breath and ran a hand through his dark hair. I poured a second mug of black coffee and handed it to him. He took it without a word, wrapping his hands around the warm ceramic. We stood there in the quiet of my apartment for a long moment. I fully expected him to be angry. I expected him to blame me for ruining his holiday or to yell at me for letting him date a fraud for 6 months without warning him. Instead, Julian looked at me with a profound sense of desperation. "The red folder you gave me last night," Julian started staring down at the cardboard box. "I thought that was the end of it. I went straight to my office after I left your parents and their house. I called my chief financial officer and we pulled the master ledgers. We spent the entire night going through the marketing budgets, the vendor approvals, everything Jessica had touched since I promoted her." I nodded, pulling my own chair out and sitting down. "I am a financial compliance officer, Julian. I know how these things work. When someone starts creating fake invoices for a shell company, they rarely stop at just one account. Fraud is an addiction. Once they realize nobody is watching, they take more." Julian let out a bitter laugh. "You have no idea how right you are, Sarah. You found $70,000 in fake marketing expenses. That was just the tip of the iceberg. That was just her testing the waters to see if our internal auditing software would flag the transactions. It did not flag them because she had the administrative clearance to bypass the vendor verification process." I leaned forward, my professional instincts immediately overriding the lingering emotional exhaustion of the morning. "How much did she take, Julian?" Julian looked me dead in the eye. "Over $300,000. The number hit me like a physical blow. $300,000. That was not just skimming off the top to pay for designer dresses and expensive dinners. That was grand larceny. That was a massive coordinated federal crime. How did she get access to that much liquid capital without triggering a board review?" I asked, pulling the cardboard box closer to me. Julian set his coffee mug down and reached into the box. He pulled out a thick stack of bank statements printed on official corporate letterhead. He spread them out across my kitchen table. She did not take it from the operating budget, Julian explained, his voice turning hard and sharp with anger. My company has a philanthropic arm. We manage a corporate charity fund designed to provide grants for local public schools to buy computers and science equipment. It is supposed to help children in low-income neighborhoods. The board gave Jessica the authority to distribute the grants because marketing handles our public relations. She was supposed to be writing checks to elementary schools. I felt a sickening twist in my stomach. I looked down at the highlighted bank statements. Line after line of massive wire transfers. $50,000 here, $75,000 there. The money was being routed directly out of the corporate charity fund and sent to a totally unfamiliar external account. Jessica had stolen money meant for children to fund her luxury lifestyle. We have a massive problem, Sarah. Julian continued pacing across my small living room. The Securities and Exchange Commission is scheduled to conduct a routine audit of our corporate charity fund in exactly 2 weeks. If the federal investigators look at these ledgers and see $300,000 missing, they will not just arrest Jessica. They will hold my entire executive board liable for gross negligence. They will freeze our operating accounts. My company will be destroyed. Hundreds of innocent employees will lose their jobs because of her. I looked up from the papers. Why are you bringing this to me, Julian? You have a chief financial officer. You have corporate lawyers. You need to take this directly to the authorities. I cannot go to the authorities until I have the entire network mapped out, Julian said, stopping his pacing and leaning over the table. My lawyers told me that if we report this now with incomplete information, the Securities and Exchange Commission will step in and shut our doors while they investigate. I need to walk into the federal building with a complete ironclad forensic report. I need every single dollar traced. I need the routing numbers, the shell companies, the exact destination of the stolen funds. He looked at me with absolute sincerity. My internal team is compromised. Jessica hired half the people in my accounting department. I do not know who is involved and who is innocent, but I know you. You are a senior financial compliance officer. You built a perfect, undeniable case against your own sister using public records. You know how she thinks. You know how to track digital money better than anyone I have ever met. I am not here to complain about my broken heart, Sarah. I am here to hire you. I stared at Julian. He was asking me to build the criminal case that would send my own sister to federal prison. For my entire life, my role in the family was to clean up the messes. I was supposed to be the silent savior, the one who took the hit, so my family could keep smiling at church on Sunday. If I did this, there would be no going back. This was not just canceling an automatic mortgage payment. This was handing the federal government the exact tools they needed to lock Jessica in a cell. I looked down at the papers again. I thought about the children who would not get computers because my sister wanted a new luxury car. I thought about the sheer arrogance on her face when she called me a failure at the Christmas table. I thought about my parents laughing along with her. I will do it, I said smoothly. I do not want your money, Julian. I will do this because it is the right thing to do. Julian let out a massive sigh of relief. He reached into the box and pulled out a second stack of documents, heavily redacted with black marker. Thank you, Sarah. We need to start immediately. My team was able to trace the final destination of the wire transfers. Jessica did not send the charity funds directly to her personal checking account. That would have been too obvious. She routed the money through a third-party holding company to wash the funds before they hit her bank. I pulled my laptop closer and opened my financial tracing software. What is the name of the holding company? I asked, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. It is a limited liability company registered in Delaware, Julian said, reading from the top page. It is called the Jenkins Family Trust. My hands froze completely. The breath caught in my throat. The quiet hum of the refrigerator suddenly sounded deafening in the small apartment. I felt all the blood rush out of my face, leaving my skin cold and clammy. I slowly lowered my hands from the keyboard. I looked at Julian. What did you just say? The holding company, Julian repeated, looking confused by my sudden change in demeanor. It is called the Jenkins Family Trust. The money was wired into their primary accounts and then slowly dispersed as consulting fees. Why? Does that name mean something to you? I could hear my own heart pounding in my ears. The sound was loud, frantic, and filled with a terrifying realization. The red folder I had brought to dinner last night was not the whole story. The charity fund theft was not the whole story. The reality was so much darker, so much more twisted than I had ever imagined. Jenkins is my mother, and her maiden name, I said, my voice barely a whisper. Julian stared at me, his eyes widening as the implication of my words hit him. I grabbed the stack of Delaware registration documents from his hands. My eyes flew across the pages, scanning the legal jargon, the tax identification numbers, and the registered agents. I was looking for the managing directors of the limited liability company. I flipped to the third page. There, printed in clear, undeniable black ink, were the signatures of the registered corporate officers. It was not just Jessica. The primary directors of the Jenkins Family Trust were Robert and Linda, my father and my mother. I sat back in my chair, staring at their signatures. A profound, sickening wave of clarity washed over me. Everything suddenly made horrible, perfect sense. For 4 years, my parents had been crying poverty. They had begged me to pay their mortgage. They had told me they were drowning in debt, forcing me to transfer $2,000 of my own salary to them every single month so they could keep their lavish suburban home. I had sacrificed my own financial security because I thought they were desperate. They were not desperate, they were rich. They were sitting on hundreds of thousands of dollars of stolen corporate charity funds. They had established a fake trust to launder the money Jessica was embezzling from Julian. They had been actively participating in a massive federal wire fraud scheme. And while they were hoarding hundreds of thousands of dollars of stolen cash in secret accounts, they still had the absolute cruelty to demand my hard-earned paycheck to cover their daily expenses. They were bleeding me dry out of pure malicious greed. Sarah, Julian said gently, noticing the color drain from my face. What is it? What did you find? They are all in on it, I said. My voice was no longer a whisper. It was hard, cold, and vibrating with an anger I had never felt before. My parents are the managing directors of this shell company. They are not just protecting Jessica, they are her accomplices. They built the money laundering network together. Julian let out a sharp curse, pacing away from the table and running both hands over his face. This changes everything. If your parents are the directors of the shell company, they are going to face federal racketeering charges alongside Jessica. The Securities and Exchange Commission will seize all their assets. The house, the cars, the bank accounts. Everything will be frozen by the federal government. I look at the signatures again. I thought about the dinner last night. I thought about my mother demanding that I apologize for ruining the holiday. I thought about my father pointing at the front door and telling me I was no daughter of his. They had thrown me out into the freezing snow to protect a criminal enterprise that they were secretly running. They had called me a failure while they were committing federal felonies. I looked up at Julian. The fear and the shock were completely gone now. I had spent my entire life trying to earn the love of people who viewed me as nothing more than a convenient ATM and a useful idiot. I had finally reached the absolute bottom of their betrayal. There was no more love to salvage. There was no more peace to keep. There was only the law. Julian, I said, pulling the keyboard back toward me. My fingers were completely steady now. We are going to map every single transaction. We are going to trace every wire transfer, every fake invoice, and every consulting fee that went into the Jenkins Family Trust. We are going to build a forensic financial report so detailed and so devastating that the federal prosecutors will not even have to work for a conviction. Julian sat back down at the table. He looked at me with a mixture of awe and profound respect. Are you sure you are ready for this, Sarah? Once we hand this over to the federal investigators, there is no stopping it. Your parents will go to prison. They will lose absolutely everything. I looked at the cardboard box full of stolen money, shattered trust, and ruined charity funds. I felt the last lingering threads of family loyalty burn away, leaving behind a core of pure, unbreakable resolve. They already told me I am dead to them, I said, my voice carrying the unyielding tone of a senior financial compliance officer. I am just making sure their empire dies with me. Let us get to work. I walked back to the desk, the soft hum of the computers, the only sound in the vast empty room. The sun was fully up now, casting long shadows across the carpet, but I barely registered the daylight. My mind was completely consumed by the intricate, sickening puzzle we were assembling. Julian and I had been working for 48 hours straight in his executive office. The large mahogany desk was completely covered in bank statements, printed emails, and corporate registration documents. The air smelled of stale coffee and exhausted determination. We had not stopped to sleep. We had barely stopped to eat. We were driven by a singular, intense purpose. We were dismantling the Jenkins Family Trust transaction by transaction. As a senior financial compliance officer, auditing ledgers is what I do for a living. I am accustomed to long hours, complicated spreadsheets, and the tedious process of tracing digital money. But this was entirely different. I was not auditing a faceless corporation. I was dissecting my own family. Every forged signature, every routed wire transfer, every fabricated consulting fee felt like a physical blow. I was mapping out the exact anatomy of their betrayal. Julian worked alongside me with an intensity that matched my own. For a man who had just discovered the woman he intended to marry was a criminal, he remained remarkably focused. He pulled server logs, granted me administrative access to the corporate archives, and cross-referenced the dates on the fake marketing invoices with the withdrawals from his charity fund. Together, we built an undeniable chronological timeline of the embezzlement. We tracked how Jessica had siphoned the money from the charity accounts, routed it into the Jenkins Family Trust, and then how my parents had distributed the stolen funds to themselves and to Jessica to fund their luxury lifestyles. By Sunday morning, my eyes were burning and my shoulders ached with a deep, persistent tension. But we had done it. We had the account numbers, we had the routing sequences, we had the undeniable proof of wire fraud and grand larceny. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair, rubbing my temples. I thought we had finally hit the bottom. I thought I had seen the absolute worst of what my family was capable of doing. I was completely wrong. The final, most devastating truth was hiding at the very beginning of the paper trail. I wanted to ensure the forensic report was absolutely flawless before we handed it over to federal investigators. I needed to establish how the shell company was originally created. A limited liability company requires initial funding to open corporate bank accounts and establish a facade of legitimacy. I navigated back to the foundational documents of the Jenkins Family Trust, looking for the initial seed money that had started the entire operation. Julian stood behind my chair, looking at the large monitor over my shoulder. He pointed a finger at the screen. "Look at the initial deposit date," Julian said, his voice raspy from exhaustion. "That transaction happened 6 months before I even met Jessica. She told me she had significant equity from a previous successful business venture. She used that equity to present herself to my board of directors as a wealthy investor and a high-level marketing consultant. That initial capital is how she gained credibility and got her foot in the door at my company." I stared at the screen, my eyes locking onto the transaction record. The initial deposit into the Jenkins Family Trust was exactly $50,000. I looked at the date of the wire transfer. It was October 12th, 3 years ago. The air in the executive office suddenly felt incredibly thin. I stopped breathing. The quiet hum of the computer servers faded away, replaced by a loud rushing sound in my ears. I leaned closer to the monitor, my heart beginning to slam against my ribs with a violent, frantic rhythm. I highlighted the date, October 12th. I highlighted the amount, $50,000. I knew that date. I knew that exact number. The memory surfaced with a sickening, terrifying clarity. 3 years ago, on the 2nd of October, I had been sitting in my cubicle at work when my cell phone rang. It was my mother. She was sobbing hysterically, barely able to form coherent sentences. She told me my father had collapsed in the driveway. She claimed he had suffered a massive life-threatening cardiac event and had been rushed to a specialized private clinic out of state. According to her panicked explanation, his arteries were severely blocked and he required immediate complex bypass surgery to survive the week. I remember the sheer blinding panic that had overtaken me. I remember standing up from my desk, the world spinning around me, telling her I was coming right away. But my mother had stopped me. She spun a convoluted story about the private clinic not allowing visitors during the critical stabilization phase, and then she delivered the devastating blow. She told me their health insurance had a catastrophic loophole. She claimed the specific emergency surgical procedure he needed was entirely out of network. The private hospital required $50,000 upfront or they would not operate. She wept over the phone, telling me they had drained their savings. She told me my father was going to die if they could not secure the funds immediately. I was 26 years old. I had just started building my own financial foundation. I did not have $50,000 sitting in a checking account, But I was the reliable daughter. I was the one who fixed the problems. I could not let my father die. I spent the next 3 days tearing my entire financial life apart. I liquidated my emergency savings. I cashed out my retirement fund, accepting massive tax penalties just to get the cash in hand. It was still not enough. I went to my bank and took out a high-interest personal loan to cover the remaining balance. I willingly destroyed my own financial future, knowing I would spend years living on instant noodles and working extra jobs just to manage the debt. On October 10th, I wired exactly $50,000 to an account routing number my mother had provided. She called me the very next day, weeping with gratitude, telling me the surgery was a complete success and that my sacrifice had saved my father and his life. Now sitting in Julian and his office 3 years later, the absolute horror of what they had done hit me with the force of a physical impact. I quickly traced the origin of the $50,000 deposit in the Jenkins family trust ledger. I pulled up the routing number of the external account that had funded the shell company. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely type. I pulled my personal cell phone from my pocket, opened my banking app, and scrolled back through 3 years of transaction history. I found the wire transfer I had sent to save my father. I compared the routing numbers on my phone to the routing numbers on the corporate monitor. They matched perfectly. There was no heart attack. There was no emergency bypass surgery. There was no out-of-network medical crisis. My father was never dying. My parents had orchestrated the most depraved, unforgivable lie I could possibly imagine. They had maliciously weaponized my love for them. They had watched me panic, watched me cry over my father and his supposed failing health, and they had eagerly taken the $50,000 I had ruined my own life to gather. They did not use it for medical bills. They took the money I bled for, and they used it to fund a fraudulent shell company. They used my sacrifice to buy Jessica fake equity so she could masquerade as a wealthy investor. They used my unconditional love to bankroll her lies. The physical reaction was immediate. My stomach violently churned. The executive office spun dizzily around me. I pushed my heavy chair back from the desk, my legs giving out completely as I sank to the carpeted floor. I pulled my knees to my chest, wrapping my arms tightly around my legs as a deep, suffocating pain radiated through my entire body. The tears came hot and uncontrollable. I did not want to cry. I had promised myself I would not shed another tear for the people who had treated me like garbage. But this was not just sadness. It was a profound soul-crushing grief. It was the absolute destruction of any lingering hope that my parents possess, even a shred of basic humanity. They had not just stolen my money, they had stolen my compassion. They had looked at their own daughter, seen her absolute devotion, and calculated exactly how much value they could extract from her terror. I sobbed into my hands, weeping for the 26-year-old girl who had sold her own future to save a father who was perfectly fine. I wept at the sheer calculated cruelty of it all. I felt completely hollowed out, empty, and sickened by the magnitude of their betrayal. My sacrifices had meant absolutely nothing to them. I was just a funding source. I heard Julian moving across the room. He did not offer empty comfort. He did not tell me everything was going to be all right because he knew it was not. He understood the absolute devastation of betrayal because his own trust had been similarly violated. I heard the sound of the water cooler running. A moment later, Julian knelt on the floor beside me. He gently placed a cold glass of water into my trembling hands. I looked up at him through my tears. His eyes were incredibly steady, calm, and filled with a hard, unwavering determination. He looked at my tear-streaked face, acknowledging my pain without letting it consume the room. "Drink this," Julian said softly. I took a shaky sip of the cold water. The chill grounded me slowly, pulling me back from the edge of the panic attack. I wiped my face with the back of my hand, taking a deep, shuddering breath to steady my lungs. Julian reached out and carefully took the glass from my hands, setting it on the floor beside us. He looked directly into my eyes. His voice dropped to a low, commanding register that carried absolute certainty. "Tears will not put them in jail," Julian said. "Evidence will." Those words hit me like a splash of freezing water. The fog of grief instantly cleared. He was absolutely right. Crying on the floor of an executive office would not change what my family had done. Wallowing in the betrayal would only grant them more power over my life. My parents had banked their entire fraudulent empire on the assumption that I would always be the quiet, obedient, suffering daughter who absorbed the pain and stayed silent. They had no idea who they were dealing with anymore. I placed my hands flat on the carpet and pushed myself up from the floor. My knees were completely steady now. The tears stopped. The crushing weight of the grief rapidly hardened into something solid, sharp, and entirely unbreakable. I looked at the computer screens glowing in the dim morning light. I looked at the mountain of financial documents we had painstakingly compiled. I turned back to Julian. The sad, victimized daughter was gone. The senior financial compliance officer was fully in control. "Let us finish the report," I said. "We are sending this to the federal prosecutors today." I arrived at my office at the logistics firm at exactly 8 on Monday morning. The sleek glass doors and polished marble floors of the corporate lobby usually made me feel a quiet sense of routine and order. Today, they felt like the gateway to a battlefield. I took the elevator up to the compliance department, set my heavy tote bag down in my cubicle, and turned on my computer monitor. For the past 48 hours, Julian and I had been drowning in the dark, twisted waters of my family and their financial crimes. We had traced the stolen charity funds directly into the Jenkins Family Trust. We had built the forensic report. It was completely finished, sitting securely on an encrypted flash drive in my blazer pocket. I just needed to draft the final legal cover letter before Julian submitted the entire package to the federal authorities. I was typing the very first paragraph of that letter when the phone on my desk began to ring. It was the front desk receptionist, a kind, observant woman named Brenda. Her voice was trembling when I answered. "Sarah, there is a situation down here," Brenda said quietly, sounding extremely stressed. "Your parents are in the lobby. They are causing a massive disturbance, and they are demanding to see you right now." I stood up, my heart doing a slow, heavy thud against my ribs. I thanked Brenda, hung up the phone, and walked out of the compliance department toward the glass elevators. I rode down to the ground floor, watching the numbers descend, knowing exactly what kind of performance I was about to walk into. When the elevator doors opened, the sound hit me before the sight did. My mother was sobbing loudly. It was not a quiet, dignified cry of actual sorrow. It was a loud, theatrical wail, perfectly designed to echo off the high marble walls and attract as much attention as humanly possible. She was draped dramatically over one of the leather lobby chairs, burying her face in her hands and shaking her shoulders. My father stood right next to her, looking stoic and deeply wounded, playing the part of the long-suffering patriarch perfectly. A large crowd of my colleagues' morning delivery drivers and building security guards had formed a loose, uncomfortable circle around them. People were whispering. Some were holding their coffee cups, staring in absolute shock. As I walked across the vast lobby, my father spotted me. He pointed a rigid finger directly at my chest, his voice booming for the entire room to hear. "There she is," my father announced, wrapping a fiercely protective arm around my weeping mother. "There is the daughter who abandoned her own flesh and blood on Christmas. There is the woman who left her sick, struggling parents to starve and freeze in the dark." The sheer audacity of his words made a bitter laugh catch in my throat. Sick parents starve in the dark. They had just returned from a luxury shopping spree entirely funded by stolen charity money. They were living in a massive suburban colonial house filled with imported furniture, but the crowd of onlookers did not know any of that. They only saw a well-dressed, weeping older couple in a corporate lobby, and they looked at me with immediate, heavy judgment. I did not stop. I walked directly into the center of the circle, stopping exactly 5 feet away from them. I did not cross my arms. I did not look away or show an ounce of shame. I stood perfectly straight, letting the tense silence stretch until my mother realized her theatrical sobbing was no longer having the desired effect on her target. She peeked through her fingers, saw my completely cold expression, and quickly stood up. She grabbed my arm, her manicured nails digging painfully through the fabric of my blazer. "Sarah," my mother whispered suddenly, dropping the loud dramatic volume and shifting to a frantic, vicious tone. "We need to go to a private meeting room right now. We have to fix what you broke last night." I pulled my arm free with a sharp, deliberate movement. "We are not going anywhere," I said evenly. "You chose to put on a public show in my corporate lobby. We can talk right here in front of everyone you wanted to perform for. What do you want?" My father stepped forward, trying to use his physical height to intimidate me the way he had done when I was a child. He leaned down, his face turning an ugly, mottled shade of red. "The bank blocked our mortgage payment this morning," My father hissed, spitting the words at me. The credit cards are locked. Jessica is a complete wreck. Julian will not answer her phone calls. You are going to call him right now, Sarah. You are going to tell him that you made a massive mistake. You are going to withdraw that ridiculous folder of lies you brought to dinner. I looked at him in genuine, profound disbelief. You want me to call the chief executive officer of a tech company and tell him that certified state bank records are a mistake, I asked. My father did not even blink. Yes, he demanded. And then you are going to go down to his office today and you are going to sign a formal confession. You are going to tell his board of directors that you were the one who manipulated the marketing accounts. You are a financial compliance officer. You have the technical computer skills to make it look like you bypassed the security system. You are going to take the blame for the missing money. I felt the air completely leave my lungs. For a moment, the lobby around me faded away. They were actually asking me to confess to a federal crime I did not commit. They wanted me to go to federal prison so my sister could keep her wealthy boyfriend and her stolen money. They wanted to sacrifice my freedom to preserve their comfortable illusion. Why on earth would I ever do that, I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerously quiet register. My mother stepped in front of my father. Her eyes were wide with a frantic, purely selfish logic that she genuinely believed made absolute sense. Because Jessica has a future, Sarah, my mother, pleaded, reaching out with both hands. Julian was going to marry her. She was going to be the wife of a chief executive. She's going to have a beautiful life in the hills. She cannot have a criminal record. She cannot go to jail. My mother gestured dismissively toward my cubicle upstairs. You are just a compliance officer. You sit at a desk all day. You do not have a husband. You do not have a public profile to protect. You have absolutely nothing to lose. You can serve a few years, and when you get out, your father and I will help you get back on your feet. It is the only way to save this family, Sarah. You have to do this for us. I stared at the two people who had brought me into this world. I looked at their desperate, intensely greedy faces. They were not trying to save the family. They were trying to save the Jenkins family trust. They knew that if Julian reported Jessica to the authorities, the federal investigators would follow the digital money trail straight to their fraudulent shell company. They would lose the stolen charity funds, they would lose their massive house, and they would go to federal prison alongside their golden child. They were perfectly willing to feed their youngest daughter to the criminal justice system just to protect their own bank accounts. The absolute lack of parental love was not just staggering, it was entirely monstrous. I did not cry. I did not scream. I felt a profound, untouchable sense of power rise up inside my chest. I looked at the two building security guards standing a few yards away and raised my hand, giving them a clear professional signal to step forward. My father saw the guards moving in. "What are you doing?" he demanded, his voice rising in sudden panic. "We are your parents. You owe us your life. You will do as you are told. You will fix this right now." I turned my attention back to my mother. She was staring at me, her eyes darting nervously as the two large security guards flanked me. "You need to leave the premises immediately," the head guard said, his hand resting firmly on his radio. "You are causing a disturbance." My mother let out another loud, dramatic sob, desperately trying to restart the theatrical performance for the audience in the lobby. "How can you be so cruel to your own mother?" she wailed, reaching out to grab me one last time. "You are destroying us." I did not pull away this time. I let her grab my shoulders. I stepped right into her personal space, leaning in so close that only she could hear my next words. The lobby was buzzing with whispers, but my voice cut straight through the noise, directed perfectly into her ear. "I know about the Jenkins family trust," I whispered. I felt her entire body violently flinch. Her hands instantly dropped from my shoulders, as if my jacket had suddenly caught fire. I kept my voice perfectly level, delivering the final fatal blow without breaking eye contact. "Julian and I spent the entire weekend mapping every single wire transfer you took from the children and their charity fund," I said softly. "The Federal Bureau of Investigation will have the complete, undeniable forensic report tomorrow morning. You are not just losing the house, Mom. You are going to federal prison." The physical transformation was instantaneous and terrifying. All the fake tears stopped immediately. The dramatic sobbing vanished into thin air. The blood completely drained from my mother, and her face leaving her skin a sickly chalky white. Her jaw went completely slack, her mouth hanging open in absolute paralyzed horror. She stumbled backward, bumping hard into my father. He grabbed her arm to steady her, looking confused and angry by her sudden silent panic. "Sandra?" "What did she say?" my father asked, shaking her arm roughly. "What is going on?" My mother could not speak. She could not breathe. She could only stare at me with wide, terrified eyes. In that exact second, she finally realized that the quiet, submissive daughter she had bullied and used for 29 years had just meticulously dismantled their entire criminal empire. She realized there was no escape. There was no fake confession that could save them now. I had the documents, I had the proof, and I had absolutely zero mercy left to give. Escort them out. I told the security guards, my voice ringing out clearly in the quiet lobby. If they refuse to leave, call the police and have them arrested for trespassing. The guards moved in, grabbing my father by the arm. He started to shout, struggling against their firm grip, demanding to know what I had whispered to his wife. But my mother did not fight back. She let the security guard guide her toward the revolving glass doors, her legs moving mechanically, her eyes completely vacant and staring at the floor. She looked exactly like a ghost. I stood in the center of the lobby, surrounded by my silent, staring colleagues, and watched my parents being physically removed from the building. The heavy glass doors spun, pushing them out into the cold morning air, banning them from my life forever. I turned around, smoothed my blazer, walked back to the elevators, and pressed the button for my floor. The doors closed, taking me back up to my office. The desperate ambush had failed. The ultimate truth was out, and the heavy hammer of justice was finally about to drop. The text messages started coming in at 3 a.m. on Tuesday. My phone vibrated against the nightstand in the dark. I did not block Jessica on my new number because Julian and his legal team needed me to keep a line of communication open just in case my family tried to tamper with the evidence or flee. I picked up the phone and read the barrage of messages. They were drastically different from the furious, entitled demands she had sent on Christmas morning. These were erratic, desperate, and deeply manipulative. "Sarah, please. I have nowhere else to go. Mom and Dad are panicking. Julian froze my bank accounts. I am so scared. I cannot go to prison, Sarah. I will not survive it. If I get arrested, I am going to end my own life. I mean it. I cannot live with this shame. Meet me at the old diner on 4th Avenue, the one we used to go to when we were kids. Please just give me 10 minutes. Well, I will do whatever you want." Threatening self-harm is the ultimate weapon in a manipulator and her arsenal. For 29 years, a message like that would have sent me running out the door in a blind panic, eager to sacrifice my own safety to save my sister from herself. But I was no longer the naive family scapegoat. I was a senior financial compliance officer who had just spent the last 48 hours uncovering a massive money laundering network run by my own flesh and blood. I knew exactly what she was doing. She was out of options, so she was resorting to emotional blackmail. I replied with a single sentence: "I will meet you at noon." Before I left my apartment, I made my preparations. In my line of work, you learn very quickly that oral agreements and tearful promises mean absolutely nothing without documentation. I opened my leather tote bag and placed a high-definition digital voice recorder in the side pocket perfectly positioned near the zipper. But I knew audio alone might not be enough to prove she was not coerced. I needed video. I took a small discreet recording device disguised as a standard black ink pen and clipped it to the front pocket of my bag. I tested both devices. The audio was crystal clear. The camera captured a perfect wide-angle view of whatever was sitting across from me. I arrived at the diner 15 minutes early. It was a rundown, greasy spoon on the edge of the city, practically empty on a Tuesday afternoon. The air smelled of old frying oil and stale coffee. I chose a booth in the very back facing the door. I placed my tote bag on the table, adjusting it so the pen camera pointed directly at the empty seat across from me. I pressed record on both devices and waited. Jessica walked in at exactly noon, and she looked like a completely different person. The polished, arrogant marketing director who had mocked my 10-year-old car at the Christmas dinner was gone. Her designer clothes were replaced by an oversized, wrinkled gray sweater. Her hair was pulled into a messy knot. Her face was pale, and she had deliberately applied her makeup to look as though she had been crying for days. It was a masterclass in performative victimhood. She slid into the booth across from me, keeping her head down. Her hands were shaking as she placed a thick manila folder on the table. For a long moment, she just sat there, letting out small, ragged sobs, waiting for me to comfort her. I did not move. I did not speak. I let the silence stretch until she realized I was not going to play my assigned role. "Sarah, thank you for coming," Jessica whispered, looking up at me with wide, tear-filled eyes. "I know you hate me right now. I know you have every right to hate me. I have been awful to you. I do not hate you, Jessica," I said, keeping my voice entirely flat and neutral. "I am just listening. What do you want?" She reached across the table, trying to grab my hands. I pulled them back, folding them in my lap. She swallowed hard, putting on a brave, tragic face. "I need your help to fix this, Sarah," she pleaded. "Julian is going to destroy me. He is going to call the police. Mom and Dad are completely terrified. They are older, Sarah. A federal investigation will kill Dad. His heart cannot take that kind of stress. You know that." I almost smiled at the mention of my father and his heart, the heart attack that never happened, the $50,000 I had bled for, but I kept my expression blank. "You stole $300,000 from a corporate charity fund." "Jessica," I said calmly, "how exactly do you expect me to fix federal wire fraud?" It was a mistake, she cried, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "I got in over my head. I was just trying to build a better life for us, for the family. I never meant to hurt anyone, but I can give the money back. I can transfer it all back to Julian and his company, and we can make this whole thing disappear before the federal investigators get involved. I just need you to help me facilitate the transfer." She pushed the manila folder across the table toward me. "I cannot access the accounts directly because Julian flagged my name in the banking system," Jessica explained, wiping her eyes with a napkin. "But you are a certified financial compliance officer. You have the credentials. I had a lawyer draft these papers. It is just a standard power of attorney and a temporary transfer of administrative rights. If you sign this, you can log into the holding company accounts, authorize the wire transfer back to Julian, and close the accounts permanently. You can save all of us, Sarah." I looked down at the manila folder. I knew exactly what this was. I slowly opened the cover and pulled out the legal documents. It was not a simple power of attorney. It was a highly complex, meticulously drafted transfer of corporate liability. The document was designed to retroactively name me as the sole managing director of the Jenkins Family Trust. It included clauses that explicitly indemnified the previous directors, shielding Robert and Linda from all past financial actions. If I signed this piece of paper, I would be legally claiming ownership of the shell company. I would be accepting full responsibility for the stolen charity funds. When the Federal Bureau of Investigation inevitably raided the trust accounts, the paper trail would point directly to me. Jessica and my parents would walk away completely clean, leaving me to face a decade in federal prison for their crimes. The sheer breathtaking evil of the trap actually made my heart skip a beat. They had tried to ambush me in the corporate lobby to force a confession. When that failed, they had sent the golden child to manipulate me into signing my own life away under the guise of helping the family. I read through the pages, slowly making sure my hidden camera was capturing every single word of the fraudulent contract. I needed Jessica to confirm everything out loud. I needed her to verbally confess to the entire operation. I looked up, letting a perfect look of hesitant sisterly concern wash over my face. I softened my posture. I made my voice sound shaky, exactly like the old Sarah who used to fix all her problems. "Jessica, this is a lot," I said, pretending to be overwhelmed. "This document transfers the Jenkins Family Trust into my name. If I do this, if I take over the trust to move the money, I need to know exactly what I'm getting into. I need to know the whole truth." She leaned forward eagerly, sensing that I was taking the bait. "I will tell you anything you want to know, Sarah. I promise. No more lies." "Okay," I said, tracing my finger over the printed text. "How long have you and Mom and Dad been running the Jenkins Family Trust? I need to know the timeline so I can clear the ledgers properly." Jessica did not even hesitate. She was so desperate to close the trap that she abandoned all caution. "We set it up 3 years ago," she admitted, lowering her voice. "Mom and Dad registered the limited liability company in Delaware to keep it untraceable. They have been managing the inbound transfers while I approved the corporate invoices from Julian and his office. And the initial funding, I asked, keeping my voice remarkably steady despite the rage boiling in my chest. "You needed capital to open these corporate accounts. Did Dad really use my $50,000 to set up this shell company? The money I gave him for his heart surgery?" A brief flash of guilt crossed her face, but she nodded quickly. "Yes, Mom came up with the idea. We needed clean money to establish the trust so the banks would not flag it as suspicious. I am sorry, Sarah. We knew you had the savings, and we knew you would only give it to us if it was a medical emergency. But we used that money to build the foundation. We did it for the family. I let that admission hang in the air, ensuring the hidden microphone picked up every single syllable. She had just confessed to wire fraud, conspiracy, and extortion. But I needed one more piece to tie the knot completely around my parents. And Mom and Dad knew about the charity funds, I asked, looking at her with wide, innocent eyes. They knew the money we are transferring back today was stolen from the school grants. Of course they knew. Jessica whispered impatiently. Dad was the one who figured out how to structure the consulting fees so the taxes would not look suspicious. They have been taking a 20% cut of every transfer for the past 6 months to pay their mortgage and country club fees. But we can put it all back, Sarah. We have enough liquid cash to cover it. You just need to sign the documents so you can authorize the release. I looked at my sister. She was staring at the pen in my hand with absolute hungry desperation. She really believed she had won. She really believed that after everything she had done, I was still stupid enough to sacrifice my own freedom to save her from the consequences of her own actions. I picked up the pen. I placed the tip against the signature line on the final page of the contract. Jessica held her breath. Her eyes were fixed on my hand. I could see the triumphant relief already beginning to form at the corners of her mouth. The crying had completely stopped. I pressed the pen down and signed my name. I did not sign my real name. I signed the name of a famous cartoon character in looping illegible cursive. It was a legally meaningless scribble on a fraudulent document, but to a desperate, arrogant criminal sitting across the table, it looked like victory. I slid the folder back across the table. Jessica snatched it up immediately. The transformation was instantaneous. The hunch left her shoulders. The tragic, victimized expression vanished entirely. She practically vibrated with smug satisfaction. She quickly shoved the folder into her designer handbag, not even bothering to check the signature. "Thank you, Sarah," Jessica said. Her voice was no longer shaky. It was brisk, cold, and dripping with condescension. "You did the right thing. Mom and Dad will be thrilled that you finally stepped up for the family." She slid out of the booth, standing up and smoothing down her oversized sweater. She looked down at me, and for a second the old Jessica returned completely. "Do not worry about the bank transfers," she said, a cruel little smile playing on her lips. "Our lawyers will handle it from here. You just go back to your cubicle." She turned on her heel and walked out of the diner, her heels clicking sharply against the linoleum floor. She pushed through the glass doors and stepped out into the busy street, absolutely certain she had just handed me the rope for my own hanging. I sat alone in the booth for 2 full minutes. I did not move. I just listened to the quiet hum of the diner and the sound of my own steady breathing. Then I reached out and tapped the button on my pen camera to stop the recording. I reached into my tote bag and turned off the digital voice recorder. I packed both devices securely into my bag. I stood up, left a $5 bill on the table for the coffee I had not ordered, and walked out into the cold afternoon air. I did not go back to my apartment. I did not go back to my cubicle. I walked 3 blocks down the street, got into my car, and drove directly to the massive glass high-rise, where Julian Reed and his corporate legal team were waiting. When I walked into the senior partner and his corner office, Julian was pacing by the window. His lead defense attorney, a sharp, incredibly intimidating woman named Evelyn, sat at the conference table. They both looked up as I entered. "Did she show up?" Julian asked, his voice tight with anticipation. I did not say a word. I walked up to the polished mahogany table, unzipped my tote bag, and placed the digital voice recorder and the pen camera directly in the center of the wood. "She showed up," I said calmly. "She brought a fraudulent liability transfer document to make me the fall guy. She confessed to the money laundering. She confessed to faking the medical emergency to steal my $50,000. And she explicitly named Robert and Linda as the managing directors and financial architects of the entire embezzlement scheme." Evelyn stared at the recording devices, her eyes widening in profound professional respect. She looked at Julian, then back to me. "You recorded a full, uncoerced confession?" Evelyn asked, leaning forward. "Audio and video," I confirmed, pulling out my laptop to upload the files. "It is a continuous, unedited recording. She details the timeline, the motive, the parental complicity, and the exact structure of the shell company." Julian let out a sharp, breathless laugh, running a hand over his face. He looked at me as if he was seeing me for the first time. "You are terrifying, Sarah. Do you know that?" I plugged the memory drive into Evelyn and her computer. I am not terrifying Julian. I am just a compliance officer closing an audit. Evelyn pressed play on the audio file. Jessica and her desperate weeping voice filled the quiet executive office clearly and loudly, confessing to every single crime she had committed. The trap had sprung perfectly. My family had dug their own grave, built their own coffin, and willingly handed me the hammer and nails. All I had to do was step back and watch the dirt fall. "We have everything we need," Evelyn said, pausing the tape and picking up her phone. "I am calling the federal prosecutor right now. We are handing over the files today." I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window and looked down at the city streets below. Somewhere out there, Jessica was probably celebrating with our parents toasting to their brilliant escape. They had no idea that the storm had already arrived and there was absolutely nowhere left to hide. The evidence was secured. The trap was closed. The final act was about to begin. The atmosphere inside the executive conference room shifted the moment Evelyn ended her phone call with the federal prosecutor. The quiet, solemn space we had occupied just minutes before was instantly transformed into a legal war room. There was no more time for reflection. There was no more time for grief. The trap had been perfectly set, and now we had to ensure the jaws snapped shut before my family realized what was happening. Within 45 minutes, 2 agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation arrived at the corporate building. They did not wear windbreakers with bright yellow letters like you see in the movies. They wore sharp, understated business suits carrying themselves with a quiet, terrifying authority. The lead investigator, Special Agent Miller, introduced himself to Julian and Evelyn before turning his attention to me. He had a stern, deeply observant face. He did not look at me with pity. He looked at me as a vital asset, a financial expert who had just handed the federal government a perfectly packaged, irrefutable case of corporate fraud. I sat at the long mahogany table and slid the encrypted flash drive across the polished wood. I looked Special Agent Miller directly in the eye. The drive contains the complete audio and video recordings of Jessica confessing to the embezzlement scheme. I said, my voice perfectly steady. It contains her verbal confirmation that my parents, Robert and Linda, are the managing directors of the Jenkins Family Trust. You will also find a 200-page forensic financial report mapping every single unauthorized wire transfer from Julian and his corporate charity fund directly into their shell company accounts. Agent Miller took the flash drive, his expression remaining completely stoic, though I could see a flicker of deep professional appreciation in his eyes. White-collar crime investigations usually take months, sometimes years of tedious auditing just to establish a basic paper trail. Fraudsters hide behind complex layers of digital deception, forcing federal agents to dig through mountains of obscure data. But I had already done the digging. I was a senior financial compliance officer, and I knew exactly how to break down the walls my family had built. "We do not have months," Julian stated, pacing the length of the conference room window. "Jessica thinks she just secured her escape. She thinks Sarah signed the liability transfer. The moment she takes that fraudulent document to her lawyers, or the moment she tries to log into the charity portal and realizes her administrative access has been permanently revoked, she will panic. We need to lock down those accounts today." Evelyn Julian and his lead defense attorney immediately agreed. She opened her laptop and began typing furiously. "I am requesting an emergency ex parte injunction to freeze all assets associated with the Jenkins Family Trust," Evelyn announced to the room. Agent Miller, given the recorded confession and the documented flight risk associated with stolen corporate funds, we need immediate cooperation from the banking institutions. We need a temporary restraining order on their personal wealth. The next few hours moved with a breathtaking, relentless speed. There was no rambling. There were no lengthy emotional discussions about family loyalty or the tragedy of betrayal. We operated purely on the cold, hard logic of the American financial and legal systems. I sat beside Agent Miller and his forensic team pulling up the digital ledgers on the large conference room monitor. I walked them through every single transaction. I showed them exactly how my parents had structured the shell company to wash the stolen money. I showed them the fake consulting fees my father had billed to Julian and his company. I showed them the exact routing numbers where the charity funds had been deposited. The federal agents worked with a swift, synchronized efficiency that was absolutely incredible to witness. While Evelyn coordinated with the federal judge to secure the emergency asset freeze, Agent Miller dispatched a team to obtain formal subpoenas for the banking records. Sitting in that glass-walled conference room, watching the machinery of federal justice mobilize against my own parents, I felt a profound sense of detachment. A year ago, the mere thought of my parents facing a legal issue would have sent me into a blind panic. I would have drained my own bank accounts to hire them the best defense lawyers in the city. But the 29-year-old woman sitting at that mahogany table was not their scapegoat anymore. I was a professional doing her job. They had stolen money meant for underprivileged school children. They had stolen my savings using a fabricated medical emergency. They had treated me like disposable garbage. I was simply returning the favor by holding them accountable to the law. By late afternoon, the federal judge approved the emergency injunction. The order was transmitted directly to the major banking institutions holding the Jenkins family trust accounts, as well as the personal checking, savings, and retirement accounts belonging to Robert, Linda, and Jessica. I watched the clock on the conference room wall. I knew exactly how the banking system worked. The moment the federal freeze was applied, a hard lock would drop over their entire financial existence. Their debit cards would be declined. Their credit cards would immediately suspend all transactions. Their online banking portals would display a terrifying, unresolvable error message. The wealthy, prestigious facade my parents had spent years cultivating was about to evaporate into thin air. Julian ordered coffee and food for the room, though nobody actually stopped to eat. We were waiting for the inevitable reaction. We were waiting for the moment my family realized their empire had just been burned to the ground. As the sun began to set up over the city, casting long dark shadows across the conference room table, the tension in the room grew thicker. Agent Miller kept his phone on the table, waiting for updates from the financial task force, monitoring the frozen accounts. Evelyn was reviewing the final drafts of the corporate fraud charges that Julian would officially sign. I sat quietly, staring out the window at the city lights turning on one by one. Then Julian and his private cell phone rang. The sharp sound cut through the quiet room like a siren. Julian looked at the caller identification. His jaw tightened. He placed the phone in the center of the table and pressed the speaker button. It was Jessica. Julian, her voice came through the speaker, frantic, breathless, and completely stripped of her usual arrogant polish. Julian, please pick up the phone. Something is wrong with my accounts. The bank is telling me there is a federal hold on my cards. Julian, I need you to answer me. I signed the paperwork. Sarah signed the liability transfer. I swear to you, I am trying to fix this. Please call me back. She was hyperventilating. The sheer panic in her voice was undeniable. Julian did not say a single word. He simply reached out and ended the call. She knows, Julian said, looking across the table at Agent Miller. The bank just denied her access. Agent Miller nodded slowly, checking his own phone as a new message illuminated his screen. It is not just Jessica, he announced, his voice taking on a sharp, urgent tone. The compliance department at your parents and their primary banking institution just flagged a massive coordinated security alert. I leaned forward, my professional instincts instantly flaring to life. What kind of alert? I asked. Agent Miller looked directly at me. 10 minutes ago, Robert and Linda attempted to execute an emergency wire transfer. They tried to move the entire balance of the Jenkins family trust, nearly $200,000 of the stolen charity funds, into an offshore holding account. When the bank denied the transfer due to the federal freeze, they immediately attempted to liquidate their entire personal retirement portfolio. My heart began to race. Liquidating a retirement portfolio incurs massive taxes and immediate federal penalties. It is the absolute last resort of someone who is completely out of options. My parents were not just panicking, they were burning the house down to collect the insurance money. They are trying to run, Evelyn stated, standing up from her chair. If they are trying to wire funds offshore and cash out their retirement accounts simultaneously, they are preparing to flee the jurisdiction. Julian paced aggressively toward the window. They cannot run. They do not have access to their money. The injunction is already in place. Their accounts are entirely frozen. They do not need their accounts if they planned ahead, I said. My voice was quiet, but the realization struck me with absolute terrifying clarity. Everyone in the room turned to look at me. I looked at Julian, then at Agent Miller. My parents are incredibly greedy. I explained, my mind racing through the financial profile of my own family. But my father is also incredibly paranoid. He spent years telling me not to trust the banking system. He always kept a massive safety deposit box at a private vault facility downtown. If they cannot wire the stolen charity funds, and if they cannot liquidate their retirement accounts, they are going to go straight for the physical cash. Agent Miller immediately grabbed his phone, dialing his field team. "What is the address of the private vault facility?" he demanded. I gave him the address. It was a high-security private storage building less than 5 miles away from where we were sitting. Agent Miller barked rapid orders into his phone, directing his agents to mobilize to the location immediately to intercept them. But as he hung up the phone, another alert chimed loudly from Evelyn and her laptop. She had been monitoring the active legal filings related to the emergency injunction. She stared at her screen, her eyes widening in absolute shock. "They are not just going for the safety deposit box," Evelyn said, her voice rising in genuine alarm. "Julian, look at this." Julian rushed over to her side of the table. I stood up and followed him. Displayed on Evelyn and her screen was an urgent notification from a highly specialized travel concierge service that my parents frequently used to book their luxury vacations. The service had a legal obligation to report high-value transactions flagged by federal holds. Less than 5 minutes ago, Evelyn read aloud, reading the urgent notification. Jessica Myers attempted to purchase 3 one-way first-class tickets using a secondary unlisted corporate credit card. A secondary card. I had missed one. In all my meticulous auditing, Jessica had somehow managed to hide a single, high-limit corporate credit card that was not directly tied to the primary holding accounts we had just frozen. She had a lifeline. "Where are the tickets to?" Julian demanded, his hands gripping the edge of the conference table. Evelyn clicked the attached flight itinerary. She looked up at us, her expression grim and urgent. "The tickets are for a direct flight departing from Seattle-Tacoma International Airport tonight," Evelyn stated clearly. "The destination is a country with absolutely no extradition treaty with the United States." The room fell into an absolute suffocating silence. The reality of the situation crashed over us like a physical wave. My family was not going to wait for the police to knock on their door. They were not going to try and negotiate a plea deal. They had realized their criminal empire was collapsing, and they had chosen the most cowardly, desperate option available. They were abandoning their house, abandoning their reputation, and using a hidden corporate credit card to flee the country and escape federal justice forever. Agent Miller looked at the digital clock glowing on the conference room wall. "The flight departs in exactly 3 hours," he said, his voice dropping into the cold, calculated tone of a federal investigator preparing for a takedown. "If they make it through international security and board that plane, we will never be able to bring them back. The stolen charity money will be gone forever, and they will walk away completely free." Julian turned to look at me. The betrayal and the anger in his eyes had hardened into absolute unyielding resolve. "We cannot let them get on that plane, Sarah. We cannot let them win." I looked at the flight itinerary flashing on the computer screen. I thought about my mother threatening me in the corporate lobby just hours ago, demanding that I sign my life away to save her golden child. I thought about my father throwing me out into the snow. They thought they could simply run away from the destruction they had caused. They thought they could leave me behind to clean up their mess one final time. They were wrong. "Let us go," I said, grabbing my coat from the back of my chair. "We are going to the airport." The drive to the international airport felt like moving through a surreal high-speed tunnel. I sat in the back seat of a sleek black Federal Sport utility vehicle, watching the blurred city lights streak past the rain-slicked windows. Special Agent Miller sat in the front passenger seat, constantly communicating with his field team through a secure earpiece, while the driver expertly navigated the heavy evening traffic with the police sirens blaring silently in my mind. Julian sat right beside me, his jaw set in a hard, unyielding line. The man who had been charming and relaxed at my family dining table just a few days ago was completely gone. In his place was a chief executive officer preparing to completely dismantle the people who had tried to ruin his company. For 29 years, my entire existence had been defined by a desperate need to protect my family from the consequences of their own actions. I had spent countless nights lying awake agonizing over how to stretch my meager salary to cover their luxurious habits. I had absorbed their insults, their passive-aggressive jabs, and their blatant cruelty, all because I thought it was my duty as a daughter to keep the peace. But as the towering glass architecture of the airport terminal finally came into view through the rain, I realized that the peace was always a lie. They had built their entire kingdom on my back, and tonight I was going to watch it burn to the ground. When our federal convoy aggressively pulled up to the international departures curb, the sheer magnitude of the operation hit me. 4 more unmarked black vehicles aggressively boxed in the drop-off lane, immediately securing the perimeter. Agent Miller turned around in his seat, his eyes locking onto mine with absolute clinical focus. He gave a single definitive nod. Julian and I stepped out of the vehicle into the freezing winter wind, flanked immediately by a team of 6 highly trained federal agents. We moved as a massive synchronized unit through the automatic sliding glass doors and into the chaotic brightness of the main terminal. The airport was packed with holiday travelers. Families were hauling heavy luggage, children were laughing, and overhead announcements echoed loudly through the vaulted ceilings. Nobody in that bustling crowd had any idea that a major federal takedown was unfolding right in the middle of the concourse. Agent Miller checked his secure tablet, reading a real-time update from the cyber division tracking the financial grid. The travel concierge service had flagged the fraudulent ticket purchase attempt at a premier international airline desk located in Terminal 4. We wove through the dense crowds, walking with a fast, heavy, and terrifying purpose. Evelyn, the lead defense attorney for Julian and his company, walked right beside me. She carried a thick leather briefcase containing the emergency federal injunctions, and she looked like a predator actively closing in on its prey. My heart pounded a frantic rhythm against my ribs, but I did not feel an ounce of hesitation. I kept expecting the dutiful, obedient daughter inside me to panic and beg the agents to stop, but that girl was dead. She died the exact moment I saw my father forge my name to steal money from underprivileged children. And then suddenly, there they were. Agent Miller raised a hand, signaling the team to halt. We stopped about 50 feet away, entirely hidden behind a massive digital departure board, and we watched them. My parents and my sister were standing at the exclusive business class ticket counter. They did not look like desperate fugitives fleeing a massive federal indictment. They looked exactly like royalty preparing for a lavish, well-deserved vacation. My mother, Linda, was wearing a brand new Mertels, incredibly expensive beige cashmere coat and carrying a pristine designer handbag that easily cost $5,000. My father, Robert, stood tall and proud in a sharp traveling suit, his posture completely relaxed, his chest puffed out with total arrogance. And Jessica was laughing. She was wearing oversized designer sunglasses pushed back onto her perfectly styled blonde hair. She held a sleek leather travel wallet in one hand and a cup of expensive artisan coffee in the other. They were actually laughing together. They were chatting enthusiastically, looking around the terminal with smug, victorious smiles plastered across their faces. They genuinely believed they had won. They thought they had successfully outsmarted Julian, outsmarted the federal government, and successfully left me behind to face the crushing weight of the criminal charges they had orchestrated. The airline attendant at the business class desk smiled politely and motioned for Jessica to step forward. We watched in absolute silence as Jessica confidently approached the marble counter. She placed 3 passports on the polished surface with a dramatic, entitled flourish. I could clearly hear her voice carrying over the ambient noise of the terminal. She was loudly demanding 3 one-way, first-class tickets on the very next flight to a country that I knew perfectly well had absolutely no extradition treaty with the United States. The attendant typed the information into her computer system, confirmed the flight availability, and politely asked for the payment method. The total price for 3 last-minute international first-class tickets was astronomically high. Jessica did not even flinch. She reached into her expensive travel wallet and pulled out a heavy matte black corporate credit card. It was the secret card, the one she had hidden from the initial audit, the final remaining financial lifeline connected to the stolen charity funds. She slid it across the counter with absolute disgusting arrogance. The airline attendant took the black card, swiped it through the payment terminal, and waited for the approval. I held my breath, clenching my fists inside my coat pockets. I knew exactly what was going to happen next. Julian knew. Evelyn knew. The federal hold I had authorized just hours ago had been brutally and flawlessly executed. The airline attendant frowned, her polite smile slipping as she looked down at her computer screen. She swiped the heavy black card a second time. She waited a few seconds, tapped her keyboard, and then swiped it a third time. We could see the exact moment the attendant delivered the fatal news. She slid the card back across the marble counter and shook her head, explaining apologetically that the transaction had been completely declined by the issuing bank. Jessica and her confident, radiant smile vanished instantly. She aggressively snatched the card back from the counter, her voice rising in a shrill, entitled pitch that echoed across the entire check-in area. She loudly demanded that the attendant run the card again immediately. She yelled that there were hundreds of thousands of dollars on that account, that she was an important corporate executive, and that the machine was obviously broken. My father immediately stepped forward to back her up. His face flushed a dark, angry red as he puffed out his chest and began to aggressively berate the poor airline worker, demanding to speak to a manager right that second. My mother clutched her cashmere coat tightly around her chest, looking around the terminal with sudden frantic paranoia. The perfect illusion was violently cracking wide open. Their flawless escape route had just slammed into a solid brick wall. Agent Miller looked at Julian and me, his face completely devoid of emotion. "It is time," Agent Miller said quietly. We walked out from behind the digital departure board and marched straight toward the business class counter. The team of federal agents fanned out in a wide, highly coordinated semicircle, completely cutting off any possible exit routes. Jessica was in the middle of screaming at an airline supervisor when she finally turned her head and saw us approaching. The color drained out of her face so incredibly fast, she looked like she might pass out right there on the polished airport floor. She dropped her designer travel wallet. It hit the ground with a soft thud, spilling platinum credit cards and passports everywhere. My mother let out a sharp, breathless gasp, taking a stumbling step backward until her spine hit the edge of the ticket counter. My father froze completely in place, his eyes going wide and utterly terrified as he finally registered the federal badges clipped to the belts of the approaching men. "Jessica," Julian said. His voice cut through the noise of the terminal like a blade of absolute ice. "Your flight is cancelled." Agent Miller stepped directly in front of my sister, completely blocking her view of Julian. "Jessica Myers," he announced loudly, his voice carrying the heavy, undeniable weight of the federal government. "You are under arrest for grand larceny, federal wire fraud, and corporate embezzlement." He did not wait for her to respond. He did not give her a single second to formulate another lie. Two federal agents moved in instantly, grabbing her arms firmly and pulling them forcefully behind her back. The harsh metallic click of the steel handcuffs echoed loudly in the stunned, breathless silence of the check-in line. Jessica began to thrash wildly, completely losing whatever remained of her polished, wealthy composure. "Julian, please," she shrieked, her voice cracking with raw, unadulterated terror. "I love you. We can fix this. You cannot let them do this to me. I will give it all back. I promise I will give it all back to the charity." The heavy theatrical tears began to stream down her face, instantly ruining her meticulous makeup. Dark, ugly streaks of mascara ran down her cheeks, making her look absolutely unhinged. She looked nothing like a wealthy marketing director heading off on a luxury vacation. She looked exactly like what she truly was, a desperate trapped criminal who had finally run out of runway. My father suddenly lunged forward, desperately trying to insert himself between the federal agents and his golden child. "You take your hands off my daughter, this instant," my father roared, his face turning an explosive shade of purple with rage and blinding panic. "This is a massive misunderstanding. You cannot arrest us. We have legal representation. I am calling my lawyer right now." He fumbled frantically for his cell phone inside his suit jacket, his hands shaking so violently he almost dropped the device on the floor. "I am calling Arthur," my father yelled, pulling the phone out. "Arthur will have your badges for this outrageous harassment." Evelyn stepped calmly to the front of our group, her expensive heels clicking sharply on the floor. She looked at my father with a smile of absolute terrifying pity. "You mean Arthur Vance, your high-priced family attorney?" Evelyn asked, smoothly tilting her head. "Do not bother calling him Robert. We already sent his office the complete unredacted forensic audit detailing your exact involvement in the Jenkins Family Trust. When Arthur saw the unassailable paper trail proving you orchestrated a federal money laundering scheme using stolen charity funds, he formally recused himself from representing you in any capacity." My father stopped dialing. His hands froze, hovering over the screen of his phone. He refused to take the case because the evidence is entirely undeniable. Evelyn continued delivering the final crushing blow without a single ounce of mercy. You do not have a lawyer, Robert. Because your accounts are frozen, you do not have a single cent to your name to hire a new one. You have absolutely nothing. The phone slipped from my father, and his trembling fingers clattering loudly against the airport tiles. The arrogant, commanding patriarch who had kicked me out of his home into the freezing snow had been entirely erased. He looked small, broken, and completely devoid of power. My mother let out a sound I had never heard before in my entire life. It was a hollow, devastating wail of pure, absolute defeat. She slumped heavily against the airline ticket counter, sliding down the front of the desk until she was sitting on the floor right next to her expensive designer luggage. Her perfect facade was completely gone. She looked up at me, her eyes completely shattered, finally realizing the true cost of her greed. Sarah, my mother, begged, her voice a pathetic, trembling whisper. Sarah, please tell them to stop. We are your family. You cannot let them take us away in handcuffs. We are your parents. You have to save us. You always save us. I looked down at the woman who had watched me drain my life savings for a fake medical emergency. I looked at the father who had called me a failure at the Christmas table. I looked at the sister who was currently sobbing hysterically as a federal agent read her Miranda rights. I stepped closer to my mother, looking her directly in the eyes. My voice was perfectly steady, echoing with the absolute finality of a closed ledger. I am not a miracle worker, Mum, I said quietly. I am just a financial compliance officer, and your account is permanently closed. 6 months later, the heavy wooden doors of the federal courthouse swung closed behind me. The crisp autumn air felt incredibly refreshing after the stifling atmosphere of the courtroom. The trial had finally concluded. It had been 6 agonizing months of legal maneuvering and endless depositions. My family had hired cheap defense attorneys because all of their primary assets had been frozen by the federal government. Those public defenders tried desperately to negotiate plea deals, but the federal prosecutors flatly rejected every single offer. The evidence Julian and I had gathered over that grueling 48-hour period was entirely insurmountable. The forensic report tracking the stolen corporate charity funds from the elementary school grant accounts directly into the Jenkins Family Trust was absolutely perfect. There were absolutely no loopholes for my parents or my sister to exploit. I had testified on the witness stand for 3 consecutive days. I had to look directly into the eyes of my mother and my father as I meticulously explained how they had structured their money laundering network. I had to publicly play the audio and video recordings of Jessica confessing to the entire scheme in that deserted diner. I watched the jury listen in absolute horror as my sister admitted that my parents had faked a massive cardiac emergency just to steal my $50,000 in life savings. The courtroom was completely silent when the recording captured her explaining how they needed clean money to fund the fraudulent shell company. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning a unanimous guilty verdict on all counts of wire fraud, grand larceny, and corporate embezzlement. The sentencing hearing was a grim and devastating spectacle. The federal judge was entirely unforgiving. Jessica sat at the defense table in a shapeless gray jumpsuit. Her bright blonde hair was unwashed and pulled back into a severe knot. She sobbed quietly as the judge handed down her sentence. 5 years in a federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. She did not look back at the gallery as the armed bailiffs escorted her out of the courtroom. Her luxurious future, her wealthy chief executive boyfriend, and her arrogant pride had all evaporated into thin air. My parents faced an equally devastating fate. Because Robert and Linda were the managing directors of the fraudulent shell company, they were held entirely liable for the money laundering operation. The federal government did not just fine them, the authorities completely decimated their financial existence. The Securities and Exchange Commission formally confiscated all of their liquid assets to pay restitution to Julian and his company. Their massive retirement accounts were completely emptied. The expensive luxury cars were towed away by federal marshals right out of their driveway. And their crown jewel, the sprawling suburban colonial house with the crystal chandeliers and the perfect landscaping, was officially foreclosed upon by the bank. The grand estate, where they had hosted their lavish Sunday luncheons to impress the local community, was now sitting completely empty, a heavy metal chain padlocked around the front gate. Every piece of designer furniture, every expensive painting, and every piece of fine jewelry was auctioned off by the federal government to repay the stolen charity funds. They were left with absolutely nothing but the clothes on their backs and the crushing weight of their own criminal convictions. I had spent the last 6 months slowly rebuilding my own life. I continued working as a senior financial compliance officer at the logistics firm. I was finally enjoying the profound peace and quiet of an existence completely free from their endless demands and emotional manipulation. Julian and I had remained good friends. We often met for coffee to discuss business strategies and compliance protocols. He had successfully saved his company and returned all the stolen funds to the elementary school programs. I genuinely thought the entire toxic saga was completely over. I thought I would never have to hear from my biological family ever again. But exactly 1 week after the sentencing hearing, my cell phone began to ring. I was sitting in my living room reading a book when the screen lit up with an unfamiliar local number. I almost let it go to voicemail, assuming it was a telemarketer or a scam call, but a strange intuition made me answer the phone. It was my mother. Her voice was not the commanding, arrogant tone she had used to humiliate me at the Christmas dinner table. It was a pathetic, trembling whisper. She sounded incredibly frail and deeply terrified. She told me that she and my father had been forced to move into a rundown motel on the far industrial outskirts of the city. She told me the room smelled of mold and stale cigarette smoke. She wept bitterly over the phone, telling me they had absolutely no money left for groceries and that they had been eating nothing but cheap canned soup for days. She told me my father was suffering from severe chest pains due to the overwhelming stress of losing his entire identity. It was the exact same script they had used 3 years ago to steal my $50,000. She begged me to come see them. She pleaded with me to bring them some cash, swearing up and down that they had changed and that they were truly sorry for everything they had done to me. She told me I was their only hope. For a very brief moment, the ghost of the old Sarah, the dutiful, anxious daughter who had sacrificed her entire youth to fix their mistakes, felt a small familiar tug of emotional conditioning. But that girl was gone. I did not feel pity. I did not feel an overwhelming urge to race across the city and rescue them from the consequences of their own actions. I felt a cold clinical curiosity. I wanted to see the final result of their boundless greed. I wanted to look them in the eyes one last time as the woman I had become. I told her I would be there in exactly 1 hour. I got into my car and drove out toward the industrial edge of the city. The landscape shifted from towering corporate buildings and clean suburban neighborhoods to decaying warehouses and cracked asphalt. The motel was a depressing, collapsing structure sitting directly next to a loud, dirty highway overpass. The neon sign out front was buzzing and missing half its letters. The parking lot was filled with deep potholes and scattered trash. I parked my reliable 10-year-old car, the exact same car my sister had openly mocked, and turned off the engine. I sat there for a moment listening to the roar of the highway traffic. I gathered my purse, locked the doors, and walked up the crumbling concrete stairs to the second-floor balcony. The air smelled of gasoline and damp rot. I found their room number painted on a chipped hollow wooden door. I knocked 3 times with a firm, steady hand. My father opened the door. The sight of him was genuinely shocking. The proud, imposing patriarch, who had always demanded absolute obedience and respect, was completely gone. He was wearing wrinkled, stained sweatpants and a faded shirt. His posture was severely hunched, his shoulders curling inward, as if he were trying to hide from the world. His face was gray and deeply lined with dark shadows of exhaustion. He did not say a word. He simply stepped back silently to let me inside. The motel room was dark, cramped, and incredibly depressing. The single window looked out over a brick wall. The air was thick with the smell of cheap cleaning chemicals and absolute despair. My mother was sitting on the edge of a sagging, stained mattress. She was clutching a thin, scratchy blanket tightly around her shoulders. Her perfectly styled blonde hair was now flat and dull. She looked up at me with hollow, desperate eyes. "Sarah," my mother cried out, standing up on shaky legs and reaching her trembling hands out toward me. "Thank you for coming. We knew you would not abandon us in our darkest hour. We knew you still had a good, forgiving heart. Please tell me you brought some cash. We absolutely cannot survive in this terrible place. The walls are paper thin. We cannot sleep. We have absolutely nothing to eat but crackers. We are your parents, Sarah. You have to help us get out of here. You have to put us up in a nice apartment until we figure out a new plan." I looked at her outstretched hands. I looked at the dark, questionable stains on the cheap motel carpet. I looked at my father, who was staring at the floor, too cowardly to even meet my gaze. They still did not understand. Even after the brutal federal trial, even after losing every single penny they had stolen, they still fundamentally believed that I was obligated to absorb their pain. They truly thought they could abuse me, steal my life-saving scheme to send me to federal prison, discard me in the freezing snow, and then simply snap their fingers and expect me to clean up the wreckage. They were entirely incapable of genuine remorse. They were not sorry for the profound damage they had caused to my life. They were only sorry that they had been caught and stripped of their luxury. I did not reach into my purse. I did not offer them comfort. I stood perfectly still in the center of the cramped room, my posture straight, commanding, and absolutely unbreakable. I looked at my father, forcing him to lift his head, and then I looked directly at my mother. "You called me a failure at Christmas," I said. My voice was incredibly calm, quiet, and echoing with the absolute authority of a woman who had finally reclaimed her own worth. "You sat at your beautiful mahogany dining table, surrounded by stolen luxury, and you told me I was a bitter, jealous failure because I did not have a wealthy partner or a glamorous lifestyle. You looked down on me because I was just a compliance officer who lived in a small, drafty apartment. You laughed at me. You told me I had absolutely nothing to lose." My parents stared at me, completely paralyzed by the cold, unyielding truth in my voice. The room was so quiet, I could hear the highway traffic rushing by outside. "But a failure would not have built the forensic case that completely took down your criminal empire," I continued, holding their gaze and refusing to let them look away. "A failure would not have mapped your entire money laundering network in 48 hours. A failure would not have traced every single stolen dollar through your fraudulent shell company and handed it directly to the federal government. I was the one who kept your fragile, pathetic lives running for 29 years. I was the foundation you built your arrogance upon. And the absolute moment I stopped cleaning up your messes, the moment I stopped being your compliant victim, you lost absolutely everything." My father opened his mouth to speak. A pathetic, broken, whining sound escaped his throat, but I raised my hand in a sharp, definitive gesture to completely stop him. "You maliciously weaponized my love for you," I said quietly, letting the heavy weight of the betrayal fill the small room. "You faked a medical emergency to steal the money I bled and starved to save. You were perfectly willing to let me go to a federal penitentiary so your favorite daughter could keep her stolen designer clothes. You made your choices. You chose endless greed. You chose spectacular cruelty. And now you have to live in this filthy motel room and face the absolute consequences of those choices." My mother let out a devastating, breathless wail. Her knees buckled completely, and she collapsed backward onto the sagging mattress. She buried her face in her trembling hands, sobbing with a deep, hopeless realization that her final desperate manipulation tactic had completely and utterly failed. The well of my compassion was entirely dry. There was no more money. There was no more forgiveness. There was nothing left but the cold, hard reality of the life they had built for themselves. "We are done," I stated, enunciating every single word with perfect clarity. "Do not ever call my number again." I turned around and walked toward the chipped wooden door. I did not look back. I walked out of the room, down the crumbling concrete stairs, and out into the bright afternoon sunlight. The crisp air filled my lungs, and it felt incredibly clean. The heavy, suffocating burden I had carried for my entire life was permanently and completely lifted from my shoulders. I got into my reliable 10-year-old car, started the engine, and put it in drive. I drove away from the decaying motel, leaving their desperate, pathetic cries far behind me in the dust. I learned a very difficult lesson through all of this. We are often taught that family is an unbreakable bond and that we must sacrifice our own peace and our own future to protect the people who share our blood. But loyalty should never be a one-way street, and love should never be a weapon used to extract your resources. You do not owe your sanity or your freedom to people who view you as nothing more than a convenient tool. Setting boundaries is not an act of betrayal. Walking away from toxic, manipulative people is not an act of cruelty. It is an act of pure, necessary survival. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply stop fixing the problems you did not create. I chose my own freedom over their comfortable illusions, and for the first time in my life, I am genuinely, profoundly happy. If my story resonated with you today, or if you have ever had to set a difficult boundary with someone you loved, please leave a comment down below and tell me your thoughts. Let me know where you are watching from and what time it is there right now. Do not forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more stories about finding justice and reclaiming your own worth. Remember that you are entirely valuable just the way you are, and you never have to set yourself on fire to keep other people warm. Thank you so much for listening, and I will see you all in the next story. 6 months have passed since that final devastating confrontation in the cramped and filthy motel room on the industrial outskirts of the city. Today, I stood in my brand new executive office and took a long, deep breath of perfectly clean, quiet air. It was a massive corner office located on the 40th floor of the corporate headquarters. The walls were made of pristine floor-to-ceiling glass that offered an absolutely breathtaking view. I looked out over the sprawling city below me, watching the early morning sun reflect brightly off the surrounding steel skyscrapers and cast a warm golden light across the busy downtown streets. For the very first time in my 29 years of existence, my shoulders did not carry the crushing, exhausting weight of someone else and their terrible mistakes. The atmosphere in my office was tranquil and perfectly serene. I held a warm ceramic cup of dark coffee in my hands, and I simply existed in the beautiful silence. There was no sudden panic tightening in my chest. There were no frantic phone calls demanding my hard-earned money to cover a fabricated emergency. There was no arrogant sister screaming about her ruined luxury vacations. There were no manipulative parents threatening my peace of mind or questioning my loyalty to the family. There was only absolute unshakable peace. I was no longer just a senior financial compliance officer hiding quietly in a small gray cubicle waiting for the next disaster to strike. Following the brutal federal trial and the complete dismantling of the Jenkins family trust, Julian had called a special emergency meeting with his corporate board of directors. They had thoroughly reviewed my massive forensic auditing report page by page. They had seen exactly how I meticulously tracked every single stolen dollar from their charity funds through the incredibly complex web of shell accounts my parents had created to wash the money. They recognized that my absolute integrity and my sharp analytical skills were something they desperately needed at the highest possible level of their organization. Julian formally offered me the position of Chief Audit Executive for the entire international company. I accepted the prestigious role with profound gratitude and a deep sense of validation. I now had an entire department of highly talented analysts reporting directly to me. I was deeply respected by my executive peers. I was valued for my sharp mind and my unwavering dedication, not just used as a convenient disposable tool to solve a family crisis whenever my parents ran out of stolen cash. And then there was Julian, working side by side in his private office for those grueling 48 hours to build the federal criminal case, had created a very unique and incredibly powerful bond between us. We had seen each other at our most vulnerable, exhausted states and our most relentlessly determined moments. We had weathered a massive corporate and deeply personal storm together, facing down an unbelievable betrayal that would have destroyed most people. Over the past 6 months, our professional partnership had slowly and incredibly naturally evolved into something entirely different and profoundly beautiful. We began sharing quiet, comfortable dinners. After long, exhausting board meetings talking about our lives and our pasts, we took long, peaceful walks through the city parks on the weekends, discussing our hopes and our true values. We eventually started a new relationship built firmly on a solid foundation of absolute genuine respect and unshakable mutual trust. It was absolutely nothing like the chaotic, deceptive, and emotionally draining dynamic he had previously experienced with Jessica. There were no calculated lies between us. There were no hidden selfish motives or secret financial agendas. There was just an honest, supportive, and deeply loving connection. Julian saw me exactly for who I truly was, and he valued me completely. He did not ever ask me to shrink myself down to make him feel bigger or more important. He wholly supported my demanding career goals, and I fully supported his ambitious vision for the future of the company. We were true equals in every sense of the word, building a life together based on honesty. Standing by the massive glass window, looking down at the tiny cars navigating the city grid, I thought back to the dark, miserable life I had finally left behind. I thought about the drafty little rundown apartment I used to live in, where the old radiator hissed and clanked loudly all through the freezing winter nights, keeping me awake with worry. I thought about the constant heavy knot of terrible anxiety that used to sit like a cold stone in my stomach every single time my cell phone rang, fearing another manufactured emergency from my mother. I remembered the endless complex spreadsheets I used to meticulously create late at night, trying desperately to figure out how to pay for my parents and their massive suburban colonial house while completely neglecting my own basic financial needs and future stability. I had actually given them my entire life savings, sacrificing my own security for a completely fabricated medical emergency. I had willingly accepted their constant verbal abuse, their cold dismissal, and their blatant, undeniable favoritism, because I was deeply and thoroughly conditioned from childhood to believe that this was simply what family love required. I had been a silent, suffering prisoner in my own toxic family dynamic, but the heavy iron doors of that psychological prison had always been completely unlocked. I just needed to finally find the internal courage to push them wide open and walk away forever without looking back. For 29 long, agonizing years, I truly believed that family meant you had to willingly sacrifice your own soul just to keep other people warm. I was taught from a very young age that my primary fundamental purpose in life was to absorb the blame, clear the massive debts, and quietly maintain the perfect, wealthy suburban illusion for my parents and my golden child sister. I honestly thought that if I just worked a little harder, complained a little less, and gave them a little more of my money, they would eventually see my true worth and love me the way I desperately needed to be loved by them. I thought my blind, unconditional loyalty would eventually be rewarded with basic human decency and perhaps a genuine thank you. I spent decades trying to earn a seat at a dining table where I was only ever viewed as the hired help. But I learned a very harsh and incredibly liberating truth through this entire devastating ordeal. Shared genetic DNA does not ever excuse emotional or financial abuse. Just because someone gave you life or happened to grow up in the exact same house as you does not give them the magical right to completely destroy your mental and financial well-being for their own selfish gain. Blood relations are not a free pass to continuously exploit someone who loves you. I learned that setting firm, unyielding boundaries is not an act of cruel betrayal against your family. Boundaries are an absolute non-negotiable matter of personal survival. When you finally draw a hard line in the sand and flatly refuse to let toxic, manipulative people cross it, you are not being malicious or selfish. You're simply making the brave, rational choice to protect your own precious peace of mind. You are choosing to literally save your own life from people who would gladly drown you just to keep their own heads above the water. If someone in your life continually treats you like a convenient stepping stone, do not wait for them to miraculously change their behavior. Do not hold your breath waiting for them to suddenly realize your tremendous value and apologize for all the pain they have caused you. People who eagerly use you to illegally or immorally elevate their own social status will never apologize for stepping hard on your back to get there. They will only ever complain loudly and play the eternal victim when you finally decide to stand up and move out of the way. So I urge you to move out of the way right now. Pull your financial and emotional support completely and step back to watch them fall. Watch their fragile, arrogant little empires completely collapse when they no longer have your quiet, resilient strength to effortlessly hold them up. It is absolutely not your responsibility to provide a soft landing cushion when gravity and the justice system finally catch up to their terrible, selfish decisions. You owe them absolutely nothing. You only owe yourself the truth and the freedom that comes with it. I know there are many wonderful, incredibly strong people watching this video right now who understand exactly what I'm talking about on a deeply personal level. If you have ever been the designated family scapegoat, I really want you to listen to my voice right now and take these words to heart. If you have ever been the one who was constantly unfairly blamed for things you absolutely did not do, the one who was automatically expected to fix every single financial disaster, the one whose incredible professional achievements were completely ignored while your siblings were highly praised for doing the absolute bare minimum, I see you. I truly see you and I validate your entire experience. I know the profound bone-deep exhaustion you carry with you every single day, trying to keep everyone else happy. I know the heavy, terrible guilt that constantly eats at your conscience when you finally consider putting yourself and your own needs first for once in your entire life. You have been trained to feel guilty for surviving. If you have ever had to make the excruciatingly difficult and heartbreaking decision to completely cut off toxic, manipulative relatives just to save your own life and preserve your own sanity, I want you to comment the word enough down below in the comments section. Please type it out in all capital letters so we can all see it clearly. Enough. Let me know that I am not alone in this difficult journey, and let us show each other that walking away from family abuse is a remarkably brave and absolutely necessary step toward genuine healing and true independence. We can build a strong, supportive community of resilient survivors right here in the comments section today. You do not have to carry that heavy, unfair burden of familial guilt anymore. You're allowed to put down the weight they forced you to carry. Please, take just one quick second to hit that like button on this video right now. Subscribe to the channel so you do not miss any of the powerful upcoming stories we have to share with you all. And please take a moment to drop a comment telling me your current location and the exact time you are watching this video today. Knowing exactly where you are in the world and when you are listening truly helps this story reach the specific people who desperately need to hear it most. Your active interaction with this video tells the algorithm that this is a powerful, meaningful message worth spreading far and wide, and you might just help someone else out there find the incredible courage to finally walk away from their own incredibly toxic family situation. Your single supportive comment could be the exact validation someone else needs to finally choose their own freedom and close the door on their abusers forever. Until next time, please remember one crucial, vital thing as you go about your day. You are the sole author of your own beautiful life. You do not ever have to accept the miserable supporting role that abusive, manipulative people have unfairly assigned to you just to keep their drama going. You have the ultimate, undeniable power to walk away from their terrible script and leave their stage completely. You write your own ending on your own terms. Take care of yourselves, protect your peace at all costs, and never ever stop fighting for the respect and the completely unconditional love that you absolutely deserve.